In 1994, a couple of young Polish guys began a company with the intent to import, translate, and distribute Western video game releases across Poland. Having grown up in a time where video games were scarce in the formerly communist country, the two set about building up their legacy of their new company, CD Projekt. As they became more accustomed to battling piracy and localizing video games, they eventually approached an up-and-coming developer about taking on the official Polish translation for their new game, Baldur's Gate. With the intent of doing things right, CD Projekt hired on well-known Polish actors to voice the game's characters, added extra items to the game's packaging, and worked tirelessly to perfect the translation as best they could. The fledgling company's efforts paid off, and they continued to work hand-in-hand with Interplay and BioWare after proving themselves. Eventually, Interplay began to falter and crumble, leaving CD Projekt in an interesting position. You see, the last big venture which the Polish company was tasked with was to help build the Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance port to the PC. Interplay's cancellation of the game meant that CD Projekt was now sitting on all of the code which made up Dark Alliance. Not wanting to toss the code aside, the team now shifted focus on developing their own game, one based off of a pretty popular series of fantasy novels revolving around someone known as Geralt of Rivia. After 5 years, many revisions, an abandoned demo, a huge scaling up of the original team, and even help with advertising by BioWare alongside their new game Jade Empire, The Witcher released to generally positive reviews and sales. Having left the game off at a bit of a cliffhanger, the fresh-on-the-scene and ever-tenacious CD Projekt Red now pushed onward towards their sequel, Assassins of Kings, while also experimenting with consoles for The Witcher 3 at the same time. After attempting to port The Witcher 1 over to console and failing, Atari demanded that the company recoup the publisher's losses, which nearly bankrupted CD Projekt after the financial crisis in 2007 to 2008. The company fought on to release The Witcher 2 to critical acclaim, selling over 1.7 million copies after coming so close to shutting down. This may have been partially due to the marketing campaign, which included adding the Witcher 2 items to Team Fortress 2, releasing a nude calendar with copies of the game attached in Russia, placing a full-blown nude spread of Triss Merigold into the May 2011 issue of Playboy in Poland, and the Polish Prime Minister gifting Barack Obama the collector's edition of the game. I know it sounds like I made up 75% of that, but I promise you that it all happened. With The Witcher 2 reaching commercial success, CD Projekt Red went on to release every game that is set out to release with no compromises and never overpromising anything ever. But that's a story for another time. When I first started PC gaming in 2011, I had a top-of-the-line Alienware gaming PC that my brother gave to me. It was built in 2007, so it was basically a pile of shit by the time The Witcher 2 released. So it sat dormant as a game I wanted to play but couldn't for another 4 years when I finally pulled that trash card out and tossed in a new one. If you're keeping up with the timeline, that would put me right around the time when The Witcher 3 was getting ready to release. Not wanting to be behind on the story of the series, I rushed through The Witcher 2 so that I could play the next game on release, which meant that I bypassed a lot of the side stuff and generally didn't take my time with the game. I had always meant to replay it, but the plight of a PC gamer means never running out of new games to play. So here we are 11 years later, and I'm ready to look at this thing with fresh eyes. For the sake of transparency, the stuff that I do remember about this game is basically the main events, which is why I decided against going down my traditional video naming route for it. So in this video, I'm going to be playing through The Witcher 2, while evaluating its mechanics, story, and characters. I'll be pointing out what I think the game did well, and what I think could have been improved, while giving my general feedback on its strengths and weaknesses. Before I begin, I'll note that I have a sponsor with Manscaped for this video that will appear about halfway through it. I know that's not going to be everyone's jam, but try not to be too alarmed. Alright, let's get to it. So at the end of the first game, our boy Geralt had found himself putting down another Witcher who had attempted to take out Temeria's King Foltest. This is where the aptly named Assassins of Kings leads on from, as the opening cutscene is one of the cooler cinematics that I've seen out of a game. It depicts a celebration of sorts occurring on the ship of the King of Edirn, Demoven III. As the festivities reach a climax, our main antagonist of the game, a Witcher named Letho, sneaks aboard before tossing a northern wind bomb which freezes most of the partygoers instantly. With all the speed and ferocity of a fully trained Witcher, the hulking man flies towards the survivors before eviscerating them all in a handful of seconds. It's a powerful introduction, and it really sets the mood for what's going on in this game. Of course, a lot of this background stuff isn't revealed yet, and someone who hasn't looked into the lore or played the games would probably see this scene as one dude coming aboard a random king's ship and taking it out single-handedly, which again is really fucking cool in its own right. From here, players have an option of firing up a tutorial or skipping it, which is always nice. It has about what you would predict a tutorial to have, though it's also a great place to talk about the general mechanics of The Witcher 2. As you might expect, movement doesn't bring much, if any, verticality to the table, at least for now, as the area is generally designed to be traversed on one plane with peaks and valleys that require holding down the W key and pointing your mouse to climb up and down. Nothing really riveting there. In regards to general exploration though, The Witcher 2 brings something new to the table that is expanded on heavily in the next game, the precursor to the Witcher sense. While not as handholdish as The Witcher 3, this mechanic basically helps to highlight various items, monsters, containers, and so on by using the Witcher medallion to send out a wave of energy. This is actually a great addition to the game in my opinion, because many areas of The Witcher 2 are dark and cluttered, and this helps me to spend less time eyeballing an area before moving on with it. In this game, it's more of a tool to aid the player, rather than a necessity to define quest mechanics with. Although that said, I kind of wish I could use it more frequently. I'll obviously talk more about what this turned into with The Witcher 3 when I get to that game, but for now I enjoy its inclusion as it saves me time when looking for specific plants in an area with a lot going on. But beyond this, there's really not a lot of new general mechanics which vary wildly from the previous entry. Instead, CDPR opted for polishing older mechanics for a new engine, which I generally have no issue with, but there is a big thing that I'll talk about later. Alchemy still allows you to craft potions, blade oils, and bombs through a meditation menu that you can activate when it's safe. There's still a toxicity meter which only allows you to consume so many potions when you prepare for combat, though this time it's more of a limit and less of a suggestion like it was in the first game, meaning that you can't kill yourself by drinking too many potions, as the game just tells you that you can't drink anymore instead. In terms of the basics of combat, you still have access to the 5 magical signs instead of having to hunt them down again, though most of their uses are the same as they were previously. Ard, Igni, and Axii are more or less identical in function to the former game, with Yrden being reworked to immobilize an opponent rather than poison them, and Quen being reworked to allow Geralt to attack while his shield is up at the cost of not being able to regen his vigor, which is basically your spellcasting and stamina pool. Now, actual fighting is a little more interesting. So the first game suffered from that kind of click an enemy and watch your guy attack sort of combat, but made up for it by having the player click in a rhythmic way to keep the attack combo going. I mentioned it before, but I did enjoy this style of combat as an enhanced version of the usual kind of BioWare-ish fighting. But The Witcher 2 takes that same kind of spirit and instead allows you to click to attack whenever and however you want, which is a lot more standard for a game like this. You have your steel sword for men and your silver sword for monsters as usual, but you're free to engage and disengage, roll to evade, parry to riposte, place traps, and toss daggers and bombs at will. While this initially did feel a lot better to me even though it was a bit clunky, I do have a lot more to say about this later. The last thing the tutorial really does is explain the leveling menu, and recommend a difficulty based off of how well you do in the arena that you wind up fighting in. I blew myself up with a trap, so I got the hard recommendation. I'll just stick to normal though to better assess how difficult various parts are supposed to be. If I feel the need to adjust it, I'll do that then. It is worth mentioning that the difficulty options do have some interesting bits to them as well. For example, the dark difficulty actually adds new items to the game, which is a really cool reward for those undertaking it. And the insane difficulty is basically hardcore mode in which Geralt can only die one time, though I do wonder if the movement and combat mechanics are fluid enough for that mode to be worth it. And as far as the leveling system goes, I'll also get to that later on. Let's jump into the story for now. So we begin a month after the events of the first game, and our opening scene has Geralt stumbling and running away from something again. CDPR had one move at this stage in terms of introductions, and this time they at least had the insight to give the players a little fan service since Geralt's shirtless this time. He isn't picked up by fellow Witchers this time around though, and instead is captured and carted off to the dungeons beneath La Valette, where he's tortured for a length of time before getting interrogated by the commander of one of Foltest's special forces, Vernon Roche. This has Geralt recalling what happened to get him into this situation. The first thing that Geralt goes over is the morning of the assault on Lavalette Castle, which was a siege launched by Foltest to suppress the mutinous rebellion which had cropped up in the area. Funnily enough, the rebellion actually happened because Foltest was fucking the Baroness here behind the Baron's back. He wound up having 2 bastard kids, and when it came out that they weren't the Baron's children, the king openly denied the accusations and mocked the Baroness. So the Lavalettes decided to start stirring up trouble to try to weaken the crown. Fucking Foltest. So yeah, since Geralt was now the King's Witcher, he was to join this battle on behalf of Foltest's army. You get to see Triss naked as fuck, which is always a treat, but I'm not showing that. The first thing that I note here is that my weapons and armor carried over from the first game. We're not going to be holding on to them for too long, seeing as we're in the Bone Zone with Vernon Roach, but they are cool to have for now. So we carry on through the camp, and it's hard not to get swept up in the game's setting. The mood is really well done, and meeting up with Foltest only further enhances that.
Sire, you said we were out of range.
That was a ballista, Excellency.
Your Grace, please take cover.
The recoil of the arms is so strong upon firing that the weapon shifts. It simply cannot hit the same spot twice.
I had no idea Your Grace was a learned military engineer.
I'm not. I gave the Baroness those ballistae 2 years ago for her birthday.
Say what you will about Foltest's never-ending quest of fucking every forbidden woman that he can, the dude is a hell of a king. It's fun watching him meet and talk with his soldiers, remembering their names, complimenting and promoting them. He's a wellspring of charisma, and he continues to stride through his camp while talking with an emissary from Nilfgaard about who might succeed Foltest on the throne when he retires. I'd love to keep talking about all of the little trivia which crops up from this string of dialogue, but we should keep moving forward here. One more important thing to note here is that Princess Ada is now married to Radovid, since we arranged all of that in the last game. I believe if we didn't import this option, Ada would have died and Radovid would have been unmarried here. This doesn't really become relevant until the end of the game, and probably not in the way that you think that it would. Eventually we climb up a big-ass Helepolis and charge our way into the fray.
Things went relatively smoothly after we came out of that tower.
Can't argue with that. Now I will say that I kind of went into this thing expecting to just slice and dice with reckless abandon, but that got me killed. So normal difficulty isn't really a walk in the park, and I am glad that I chose it. Running in and clicking repeatedly is only going to get you killed, and being more tactical with your engagements is what you'll need to keep yourself healthy. It's a better introduction to the game over the tutorial, and I feel like just playing through the prologue and having the game recommended difficulty might have been the better way to go here, truth be told. Our actual quest has us dispatching some men around a ballista which is stationed here at the very bottom of this rampart area for some reason. Maybe they were still in the middle of transporting it to the top still. Anyways, it's all set to go, and it only takes some God of War mashing to position it and destroy a barricade preventing Foltest's forces from launching an offensive further into the castle. The music's pretty great, even if it's not Banana Tiger. But there are some issues that I found myself running into that didn't really come up in the tutorial. For one, despite the large amount of soldiers escorting the king and the king himself being part of the battle, most enemies will outright ignore a soldier pummeling them and instead try to run past them to get to Geralt. You could argue that Geralt is the higher value target, but that really doesn't hold water when the literal opposing king is with him and they ignore him as soon as you charge in. It becomes clear pretty early that enemies have been programmed to prioritize Geralt, which makes an epic siege feel a lot less immersive and more like a video game level. Secondly, looting is, well, it's looting. Enemies die, eventually turn into little brown sacks of gold or weapons or whatever, and you have to manually run over to each one to evaluate the loot that dropped. I know this is kind of an older game trope, and even extends to a lot of newer titles, but it doesn't feel good to know that I might fall behind on cash if I don't make sure to halt my forward progress and reach into every brown sack that I find. Thirdly, every time there's a cutscene, the game re-equips my default battle armor, which is worse than my Raven armor from the first game. So I have to stop the action to put it back on every time. It's not a huge complaint, it's just a little bit annoying that they gave me the option to bring my old gear and then constantly overrode it for these cinematics. And lastly, I mentioned before that the tutorial map doesn't really have much verticality to it. But that's not really true when it comes to the rest of the game, as there are points where you can jump down and climb up scattered throughout this battle. It's not awe-inspiring by any means, but it does feel good to know that I can at least traverse points that I can see from below or above a lot of the time if need be. That said, it does feel like the game kinda needs to load these parts in. It's not actually what's happening. What's happening is that you can't do this stuff in combat, and the game has to register that you're done with combat. So basically I'll approach a ladder, but it gives me no option to climb, because I'm still in combat. So I basically have to wait a moment before the game will go, okay, you can go up there now, which is annoying. So when you make it to the top, Full Test's entourage have a hard time getting up to the tower where Aryan La Valette is. This is the spawn of the Baron and the Baroness, meaning he isn't Full Test's boy. So Geralt volunteers to run up alone and take care of him, which presents us with 3 options. We can fight Aryan and all of his men, we can duel Aryan 1v1, or we can convince Aryan to surrender. I opted for the last one here, which actually surprised me in terms of its outcome. I'm so used to games doing this thing where I have to pass a speech check to effect quest events. And since this dialogue involved 3 normal options, I expected Aryan to tell me to fuck off and fight me anyways. I think I was trained to expect that through BioWare games. So it is refreshing to see CDPR allow you to actually effect a quest through normal dialogue. The end result has La Valette Castle falling to Full Test, and Aryan getting carted off to the dungeons to be tortured. After the battle, a dragon shows up at the castle and just raises half the damn thing. This game did come out before Skyrim, so I hope CDPR got permission to release it beforehand from Bethesda. Anyways, we run away like normal people would. But Full Test is mad at the dragon and wants a crossbow to kill it like the Chad that he is. God, I love Full Test. But that's really all there is to the dragon ordeal for now. The climax of this entire prologue sequence begins when it becomes clear that the rebels which have refused to surrender have holed up in the monastery with the king's bastard children. The doors are too reinforced to bash down in any feasible amount of time, so Geralt has to try to infiltrate a supposed secret entrance located somewhere around the castle. This expands on the game's town mechanics a little bit, and has you choosing whether to help the townsfolk of La Valette or let the soldiers continue to pillage and burn them alive. I decide to try to save as many as I can, which usually winds up with Geralt interfering with whatever wartime atrocities Full Test men are committing, and then getting the option to extort the townsfolk for himself, or to just let them be on their way. Following in the last game's footsteps, the experience system here is kinda fun in that you'll gain less experience but more gold for demanding the townsfolk to pay you. But you'll gain more experience if you let them go with no payment for your services. It's a weird balance because Geralt has always been pretty money-minded in regards to performing services for people, but I've always seen him as more charitable with those in a shitty position. And that's not to say that he can't be both, but it is fun to be able to replay a game and go the full money-grubbing bastard route after going through this once already as a kind soul who helps the weak without expecting payment. It is kind of funny to send these soldiers packing only to rob the now empty houses of their cash though. Another thing worth noting is the expansion of the dialogue system here, which sprinkles in persuasion, intimidation, and the fuck you button. The fuck you button has you Nardo hand sign casting Axii to forcibly convince someone to do what you want them to do, whereas the persuasion and intimidation options, come on, you know what those do. Now all 3 of these fall into a weird and kind of flawed system. Basically, every time you get the option to persuade, intimidate, or Axii someone, there seems to be a dice roll in the background as to whether or not you succeed. Every time you do pass one of these checks, the attribute that you use to do so goes up a level, all the way up to 3, which means that you can get all of these up to max level in a matter of the first act and prologue. No one seems to know exactly how it works from what I've gathered in my research online, which is annoying because sometimes you'll fail a check, reload, and have it succeed the second time. So it's basically the Fallout 3 system, which I'm not opposed to as a concept, but I at least had the odds displayed on the screen when I was playing that game, and I don't here. So sometimes I'll try to reload a few times only for it to not work out every time, and now I'm not sure if this was just an automatic failure or something with a low chance of success. It's not a great system, unfortunately, and I feel like I would have been able to endorse it more if all of the rules were displayed somewhere in the game. Although speech checks don't really show up that frequently, and they don't seem to have a ton of importance either, so I guess it's just something that I'll have to live with. There are also a surprising amount of open doors to explore and loot the buildings that they lead into. I'm so used to games just plastering doors all over a town that don't function or are locked, so that was a nice surprise. I mean, sure, there's still a handful of locked doors, but most of them actually opened up. To be fair though, it's not as if I found some secret rare item or a villager with a quest or anything interesting like that. So I guess as long as houses tend to be just little loot piñatas, I'm really not too invested in whether or not they actually open for me. Eventually we make it to our government-mandated sewer level complete with drowners and one-liners.
I'm too old for this.
We fight our way through to the monastery, let the good king and his men through, and talk to this gray alien in disguise, who tries to make a stand against the king by quite literally taking the holier-than-thou path.
Where have you taken the children?
The Solar. They're in the Solar.
That seems successful to me. Anyways, we start heading towards the area with the kids, and I get this lovely pop-up telling me to dodge the dragon's attacks with right-click.
The dragon's back!
Oh my good god, that fucking frightened the shit out of me. I was not ready for jump scares in this game. So yeah, it's 2011 and QuickTime events are... were they prevalent still back then? I thought that was more of a mid to late aughts kind of thing. Well, whatever. It looks about as goofy as it feels, and is about as riveting as changing the batteries in a controller. Geralt scares it off by gently placing his silver sword through the roof of its mouth, which gave me a fright because that was a good sword. But it's okay, it came back to him like Kratos' axe, thankfully. So this is the scene that I've been waiting for since the start. As we walk up the stairs, Foltest promises Geralt that he and Triss can go free from his service after all of this, and that he's gonna give him an assload of gold. Then he meets with his children, who hug him before going away. If we squeeze any more death flags into this scene, we're running the risk of Foltest dying from a heart attack before anything else happens. But yeah, this old blind priest who's built like a brick shithouse is actually Letho if you couldn't tell. I mean, I have the knowledge of hindsight here, so it's not exactly fair. But watching it back now, it's actually pretty obvious if you're looking for it.
Go, Boosie. Boosie. They have your eyes, sire.
So Letho gets our boy Foltest with the 1-2, and then jumps out the window. Geralt does not pursue, leaving him in the precarious position of having his weapon drawn while looming over the corpse of the King of Temeria. We've all been there. So that's why our boy is locked up in the fungeon with the rest of the filth.
Bring us food and drink.
Shame you didn't think of that earlier.
Bring something to drink. We can't sit here cotton-mouthed.
The main lead that Roche has to go off of here is that there were some Scoia'tael which were ready to help Letho escape, ones who wore his regiment's colors on their masks as trophies. He pieces together that this means that they belong to a unit of elves led by someone named Yorveth. Deciding that he believes the Witcher about the events which he told him, he gives Geralt the key to his cuffs, and tells him when and where he's leaving town to pursue Yorveth's group. You would think that someone with access to magical hand signs would, I don't know, have his hands better restrained. You'd think he'd be able to Igni or Axie his way out of this. But whatever. From here we get into a brawl with one of the guards, which is definitely done a lot better than the hand-to-hand combat in the last game. Well, I guess depending on who you ask. It's a QuickTime event. But I don't mind it as much because the choreography of the actual fighting feels like a real brawl rather than someone with paper arms lightly tapping a pound of ham repeatedly. Still, if you absolutely detest QTEs, I could see you not enjoying this facet of the game. Either way, you just press WASD whenever the game tells you to in order to punch, dodge, combo, and grow your hair out. So this game has it all, as the next bit is an optional stealth section. I definitely understand the spirit that they were going for here, but I historically have not been too good at stealth. This is particularly true when I don't have vision cones of the guards on my minimap. So after some practice, I managed to knock the first guard out before completely fumbling on the second, third, fourth, and fifth guards. I don't know, it just doesn't feel like the movement is fluid enough to warrant this kind of gameplay. And even though there have been older games with less fleshed out motion that have done fine with stealth, they tended to make up for the clunkier movement with other tools for the player to use when sneaking about. Regardless, I gingerly beat every guard's ass on my way out before running into Arian, who manhandles the guards who are escorting him before Geralt runs up to him like a lunatic and tells him that they gotta get out of here. Having spent literally all of his strength dropping his enemies like a Ukrainian farmer taking on armed Russians, Arian decides that he's gonna sit on the floor until Geralt clears the path ahead. The next stealth section is a lot more manageable, as guards don't tend to notice you sneaking up on their patrol routes. The movement still isn't super great, as I tend to stick to a wall for a moment and then try to adjust and wind up walking out of my stealth position. Still, we clear the way out and help Arian to freedom. Well, Geralt gets freed. Arian uses a torch directly on barrels of oil and blows the fuck up, or so it seems. But that's a spoiler, and we do not spoil games on this channel. So we meet with Triss and Roach and hightail it out of there to a small backwater town named Flotsam, where a cutscene plays out depicting Letho striking a deal with Yorvith. This game is an absolute renaissance of animated styles when it comes to its cutscenes, as the usual stuff shows the in-game graphics, the important scenes are more rendered, the map scenes showcase a stylized 3D look, and the flashbacks and chapter summaries show an interesting 2D take on Geralt's memories. Either way, we're on to Chapter 1. Our objective in Flotsam for now is reconnaissance to see what we're up against, which has our trio stepping off the boat and into a swampy, marshy area of the woods. Our scouting dialogue isn't, great.
What about roads through the forest?
Yorvith rules the forest. Where are we?
In a forest?
Very funny. But who does it belong to?
Yorvith, maybe? I know more about the Pontar Valley than you think.
And it really doesn't get too much better when we run into Yorvith, who's playing his plastic recorder up ahead while he waits for us.
Vernon Roach, Special Forces Commander for the last 4 years. Servant of the Temerian King. Responsible for the pacification of the Mahakaman foothills. Hunter of elves, murderer of women and children. Twice decorated for valor on the field of battle. The Nightmare of Franklin Avenue, Vice President of the Temerian Book Club for Sad Orphans. Seedom and Breedom Roach, the so-called cumbersome castrator. The cause of the 1251 water crisis and potato famine. Stepfather to 3 darling children. Captain of Temeria's dodgeball team. Bachelor's degree in economics. The Cuddle Monster. High-level World of Tanks PvP enjoyer. Yearly contributor to the annual Brevard Alzheimer's Barbecue. Thank you for your generous contributions. Anonymous Dragon Age 2 Defender on /V. Racist. Well, that one I saw that on Twitter. I didn't really look into it yet, but...
Yorvith, a regular son of a whore!
Well, at least Vernon was concise with his greeting. So they get through with greeting each other, and Yorvith basically takes the stance that he's helping Letho because of his history of racial conflict between the elves and the humans. And as long as Letho's killing kings, he doesn't mind helping out a human. It's strange though because this dialogue is very flip-floppy in how it's approached. Basically, Geralt goes, "I can't believe you're working with a human, isn't that against your code?" And Yorvith goes, "Nah, he's a cool dude." And Geralt goes, "Whoa, hey, let's not make a big deal about race, what the fuck?" Alright. Anyways, Yorvith is clearly being manipulated here, but he's too blinded by centuries of racial prejudice to see that, which kinda makes sense. Geralt tries to straighten him out and talk this through, even pointing out that he knows that there are a group of archers nearby with their bows aimed at the party. And Roach, in all the wisdom of a top-secret Special Forces commander, whips a knife at Yorvith after Geralt just pointed out that there's an ambush nearby. Of course, the elves fire on the party, and Triss spends all of her energy putting up a full-circle shield that stops the arrows before passing out. Holy shit, these guys are pros. Fuck, that was our only plan! The next stretch of road has us protecting Roach while he plays with Triss's butthole all the way up to the nearby town of Flotsam. Upon making it to the village, the elves stop firing before it's revealed that Letho knows Geralt, even if Geralt doesn't remember him. It's also revealed that Zoltan and Dandelion are about to be hanged for various reasons by the town's fear-mongering lawmen, leading into one of the funnier scenes that I've watched in a game for having such dire music.
The charge is collusion with a Scoia'tael.
Dandelion, an elven spy?
The bard's hanging for debauchery.
What?
The sentence was he's to hang for debauchery.
What?
Piss off, freak!
Well, freak he may be, but he speaks true.
Debauchery's one of my favourite pastimes, but I don't want a noose placed round my neck for pursuing it.
This is a decent town. Whores and witches notwithstanding.
Watch your words, guardsman! I don't know witches, but Margot's a decent woman!
Thinks he's tough, showing off his balls. But don't fret, people. I've seen the rot on them.
I'm warning you for the last time, Margot!
Look here out! Assaulted an officer!
I'd like to report. Out of my sight, Clover.
Yeah, this town is a fucking mess. I mean, I understand why, though. Their king was just murdered, and they live under constant threat of elves, which seem to pick off any humans who wander too far out of town. So how do you fight against an enemy who has the moral high ground of being racially repressed historically? Well, you use more racism. And fear. Yeah, sure, that should solve things. Well, Geralt saves his friends in the nick of time, and agrees to meet them at the nearby tavern. Thankfully, no one important died in the rescue attempt, so we're in the clear there. So here we are for a second round of villaging, except this time the game just kinda lays it all on you. I won't bother jumping into every little thing that I do here, but it does seem like after the stay of execution, the game just hammers you with everything that you can do. There are shops, there's a craftsman, there's an inn, there's a barber. There's a notice board with your usual suspects listed for trophy hunting ranging in difficulty from simple neckers to a troll. You can take on various people in dice poker, arm wrestling, or brawls. I spent my first moments in Flotsam running around and seeing where I could go and what I could do, which is pretty standard for the Witcher experience going off of the first game. You still have to gather knowledge on creatures in order to bring back the parts that you need for the monster hunting. Everything seems to cost a boatload of cash, from equipment to crafting materials to recipes, and it discouraged me from buying anything until I gathered a little more knowledge about what I actually want. As a basic rule though, I noticed that the item prices tended to correlate to the stats of the item pretty reliably. So for example, a steel sword with 11 to 14 damage on it runs me just under 400 gold. The rune sword that I brought from the first game does 10 to 12 damage, but it has a 2% chance to instantly kill an enemy. This means that it costs just under 600 gold, which is about the value that I would expect, honestly. Things tend to translate pretty well this way, which is a great way to handle the equipment for me at this stage since I'm not entirely sure what the most important stats are. Oddly enough, The Witcher 2 cuts back on Geralt fucking every hole between him and Skellige, and instead only has him optionally banging the occasional hooker and a few other notable encounters later on. I guess it was easier when these sex scenes just turned into playing cards rather than showing any of the models getting it on in any way. Either way, I head off to talk to the man in charge of the town who's hiding something in his backyard. This leads into another stealth section, though this one is a lot easier. I think I just had issues with the movement at first, and the fact that the first guard didn't move until I dove into a nearby cell. You can fail this section and not gain a set of armor and the knowledge of what the man in charge Laredo is up to. When I do meet up with Laredo, he basically says, "Hey look, I'm a bit racist, but Yorvith is more racist. How can we heal racism if he continues to be more racist than me?" That's a fair point, Dorito, fair point.
Among Us.
I still haven't heard Yorveth's side, but I do know that you can wind up choosing between his side or Roach's down the line. We'll see how that pans out. For now, I'm off to gather monster bits and investigate what the map looks like outside of the Karas docks here. The initial woods outside of Flotsam are a terrifying but really intriguing mashup of clumped-together trees, neckers, and endriga. The game does not pull any punches at the level that I'm at, and I found myself having to pull away from performing nearly any side quest until I got better leveled and or equipped. At first, I actually wasn't too sure how to feel about this. I mean, on one hand, it felt great to be challenged, and it really added to the idea that the forest is dangerous as all hell. But on the other hand, I ran into the woods to do side quests, only to find out that the Endriga Queens destroy me, Wraiths fuck me up, and I couldn't even destroy the Necker nests because I didn't have access to the Grape Shop bombs. So it was one of those things where I wanted to side quest in order to level up. And then I felt like I needed to level up in order to side quest. So my experience instead involved me kind of just trying to uncover the fog of war from my map, and then seeing what I could handle a bit at a time. This actually wound up with me learning how to fight a lot better, which I'm gonna get to more in a moment. The exploration isn't half bad, though it would be a lot more maddening if it weren't for my amulet being able to detect item drops and the like, as nearly everything gets kind of lost in this absolute mosh pit of geometry. The actual level design of the map is a bit lackluster also, and that becomes a lot more apparent the more that you run around it. Because while I can admire the densely packed areas of trees which open up into this murky swamp, traversing it feels very much like I'm following a very rigid guideline of paths. You can't slide off a chunk of rock or climb up over a ridge which isn't programmed to be climbed up over. So while the actual visuals of the area are nice, the movement and map layout are a bit awkward to navigate around. And it really makes me wish that I could fast travel to key points, as jogging from one end of the forest to the other gets grating, and this only becomes a lot worse in Chapter 2. But probably most importantly, exploring through Chapter 1 really made me understand what exactly is going on with the combat. And at first glance I thought to myself, well, it's not that bad, even though I remember it being abysmal. You see, there's something vaguely familiar about the combat that I just couldn't wrap my head around at first. And I think a lot of that stemmed from playing with a mouse and keyboard. But the game series that the combat of The Witcher 2 reminds me of is a shoddier variant of FromSoft's Soul series. And I know that's such a meme, but I'm not comparing the two like a modern game journalist pointing at any third-person adventure game and going, wow, it's a Souls-like. I'm comparing the two in my playstyle that I found myself adopting to survive. Swinging wildly gets me killed. Rolling is a godsend in terms of avoiding damage. To a degree. Enemies tend to be set up to swarm you, making you figure out how to isolate and pick them off one by one. There are quite a few parallels, and while I wouldn't call The Witcher 2 a Souls-like, I would say that I definitely see the Demon Souls influence the more that I play it. I'm actually glad that I wound up playing on normal because I think that the optimal experience for those who want a fair degree of challenge to their combat is normal. The movement unfortunately doesn't always feel like I'm in control of Geralt when he slides a bit further than I want, or rolls a little awkwardly during a fight. And this became more of an issue with later fights in particular. I will say that skirting fights that were too tough for me eventually had me learning exactly what I needed to do to win fights that I initially had problems with. For example, Quen absolutely shined in the earlier fights of the game, since it basically negates the damage from one hit. So the strategy for me at the time evolved into casting Quen, charging in and slashing, taking a hit, rolling out, and then backing off to cast it again. This dialed me into a loop of relatively high-stakes combat, which felt really rewarding to finally get the hang of, and invigorated me in a way that I didn't think that this game could manage. And then the Letho fight happened, and I realized every single thing that was holding back this game's combat all at once, like some god reached down and gave me 2 more eyes to see with. I was having a decent amount of fun in the early game because I was approaching the game with an amount of optimism that helped me to go through the hoops that the devs had set up for me. And at this stage in the review, we're not that close to the Letho fight. But I have to put it in the combat section because it gave me a perspective that made me realize that the combat in this game isn't just abysmal, it's so flawed that trying to describe it is like trying to describe Twitch's sexual conduct rules. Simply put, this is the hardest fucking fight that I've had to deal with in a very, very long time. This is where the Souls fanbase would tell me to get good. But asking me to simply play better here is an exercise in futility when the combat is this broken. I thoroughly remember how frustrating this fight was during my first playthrough. And I don't know how I did it then. I think I knocked the game down to easy. Because Letho is built like an endgame boss. He actually is an endgame boss. And I felt more underleveled than I've ever felt in a game when I tried to take him on despite having done every single side quest in the game so far at the stage that I fought him at. Everything about my style of play went out the window, as riposts are nearly impossible with my 2 bars of vigor. Quen becomes too cumbersome to cast and is tossed aside by anything that Letho does. Letho's Igni does an insane amount of damage, as do any bombs that he happens to hit me with. I die in about 4 good hits from any given attack by him save from his Ard, which blows me across the room like a paper bag in a hurricane. Now mind you, my potion buffs from before wore off during the dialogue prior, as they keep ticking for some reason while the dialogue plays. And even oiling my blade doesn't seem to give me any significant advantage. Arding him would at least stagger him and back him off for a moment, but it wasn't enough. Yrden was good for keeping him still while his monstrous Quen was up. Whenever he did get a Quen up, the only thing that I could honestly do was run away and dodge his bombs and signs. But this was just all shit that he does, right? It sounds manageable for an average person who just simply plays better. But this just isn't the case, because the hitboxes and animations in this game are just wrong. I don't know how else to say it. If Letho swings and I'm rolling away, there's a chance that Geralt will take damage. And it happens before his animation even theoretically connects with Geralt, if that happens. And I know this because of the bleed buff. Simply put, if the game realizes I'm in range of an enemy's attack and I haven't rolled yet, it will instantly hit me with a debuff and/or damage. So reacting to nearly anything is an exercise in futility, as the game has decided that it doesn't matter whether Letho's sword hit Geralt. It only matters if Geralt was in range at some point. I hadn't realized that this was happening before this fight because the game's enemies weren't doing this much damage to me. The only way that you can counter this system is by preemptively rolling before the animation starts, which is an absolutely moronic way to play a game. The combat of this game is horrible, but you can see what they were trying to do with it. And I wish that I could see the positive side of it, but this one boss fight made me realize that they needed to spend time making the animations of an enemy matter. I mean, at least if you're gonna go down the adventure RPG route, which is what The Witcher 3 did also later. Because as of right now, it almost feels like I'm playing an older MMO, or even the first game again. Because the animations don't matter when it comes to damage in those games either. It might also explain why the combat has to end in order for you to loot items or interact with the environment. Like I said, the development history of this game was a little odd. And I imagine that they initially intended for the game to play more like, I attack and hit, now you attack and hit, rather than an actual action RPG with proper hitboxes and dodging. It's almost like they played Demon's Souls and went, oh shit, let's do that instead, only to combine that back and forth kind of system and create a hybrid of combat that shouldn't ever exist. This is seen particularly with dodging. This is, again, something that I didn't pick up on until about midway through chapter 2 or so, and then I had to come back and write it into the script here. But when I go to attack, I cannot do anything else but finish my swing. And that would be fine if the enemies played by the same rules, but they don't. They can start to swing, go, oh shit, here he comes, and then they can block your attack mid-swing. And that's absolutely horrid to have to deal with because it made me play the game fundamentally different than I ever would have played it. In this case, it was more about spamming Ard and then slicing away, and then spamming Ard and then slicing away. I don't know, either way, that's my combat rant for the moment. Let's get back to chapter 1. There's a technical term for the way that I approach the swamp, which is known in some scientific circles as ass backwards. Basically, I went one of two ways, and the way that I chose had me running through the tougher parts of this woodland area before making it back to the outskirts of a small village that's nestled against Flotsam. Along the way, I wound up talking to a bridge troll whose wife was murdered by some mercenary types who had been working for Laredo. I also found the guy who sells grape shot and grape shot accessories for my Necker endeavors. Stumbled into a scene where an elven woman is being accused by the guard of working for Yorveth's troop. And discovered evidence of Laredo actively working with ex-Salamandra to bolster the illegal fist tech trade while plotting high treason against the nation. While I won't bother fleshing out every single plot point of every single side quest here, I mentioned all of these because The Witcher 2 takes on a pretty rare philosophy that often isn't seen in more modern quest design. Instead of taking a bunch of subpar to good quest ideas, loading them into a blunderbuss and then peppering the game with them, CDPR instead decided to go with a more focused approach that wound up coding the game in a decent amount of quests that were more quality driven than quantity, at least as far as chapter 1 goes. We'll get more to chapter 2 and 3 when we get to chapter 2 and 3, but this does change a little bit. Likewise, as far as this chapter goes, there were a few quests that I looked at and was completely apathetic towards, and instead found myself somewhat too thoroughly enjoying my time on each quest. I wound up getting a tattoo while blackout drunk, putting an end to a Salamandra organization which set up shop here, and participating in a fight club ran by Laredo in his own backyard.
Your next opponent is Smugface, also known as Tasseldick.
There is one side quest in particular though that I really want to talk about. In an old abandoned mental hospital that had long burnt down is a man trying to desperately get back to his comrade who is trapped in by wraiths. Throughout it are, wraiths as you could imagine. But there are also ghostly after images of long dead patients, along with old hospital files indicating the various treatments of the mentally ill, most of which were experimented on by the hospital staff. Eventually you find the comrade's friend, who's close to having a mental breakdown. After calming him down, he explains that he used to be part of Eddern's army. Well, the chunk of that army which was stationed at the hospital learned of a rumor while at war with Nilfgaard. A rumor which told of countless riches squirreled away by the Nilfgaardian army. After torturing a captive Nilfgaardian who was said to know its location, they had him draw a map of where it was. As the men grew more obsessed with the idea of vast riches, they began treating the patients in the hospital more violently, culminating in a priest trying to intervene only to have his head split open. Soon they decided to draw and quarter the prisoner that they had extracted the treasure location from in front of the patients, which of course sent them into a frenzy. The Eddern boys then decided to simply slaughter every single patient here besides the most attractive female one, who they used as a plaything. A fire broke out during this slaughter, and the Eddern army vacated the hospital before setting up further away. The woman who was abducted then slit the throat of the commander before escaping with the map to the treasure. And that was the end of the loot hunt until now, when these two knuckleheads came back to see what they could dig up. It's a heinous, vile, disgusting story, one that had me fully invested in every sense. The curse which lingers in this hospital wound up being caused by the prisoner who the men quartered, and likewise it wants revenge in order to leave this plane. And witchering be damned, I gave that ghost what it wanted when I told the two men up top to come with me to see what I found. I have nothing but love for this quest. And the idea that it has two endings and also links back to Laurito's mother, who was the female victim that the Eddern soldiers abducted, is just the cherry on top. It's a fantastic side quest, and while I would consider it the best of what I got, a lot of the questing in this chapter falls into this more quality-driven narrative that makes playing through random side quests all the more worth it.
Prepare, Witcher. And now, watch this.
If anything, I would say the arm wrestling along with the dice poker and brawling systems from the previous game kind of fill in the gaps of space for those who want to spend as much time as possible with this entry, as those do inadvertently lead to other associated quests involving taking on the strongest opponents in each regard. Dice poker has been streamlined in this game to encompass one round, but at the expense of being able to just roll your dice off the board. And if you do that, you just don't get those dice anymore, which really discourages getting in the spirit of rolling and instead just kind of encourages you to drop your dice in a clump. The equipment system is something I didn't quite invest looking into until pretty late into Chapter 1, as I wasn't sure how abundant my upgrades would be. A lot of the best armor and weapons that I could find tended to be crafting recipes which required grinding out monster fights for the bits that they drop, which is never a fun time. So usually I wound up settling for something lesser just for the sake of convenience. I guess it makes sense, and it definitely isn't a unique philosophy, as even the best games tend to make grabbing the best gear at any given time a grind. Let's finally touch on the leveling system now that I'm balls deep into this game. So leveling is a bit interesting because you can't just start going down whichever tree you want. Instead, you have to sink 6 points into the training tree before you can touch the magic, alchemy, or swordsmanship trees. It's not the worst way of handling your leveling system, but it does feel like I have to pop on my training wheels for a bit before I can get to the real stuff with the way that it's presented. Furthermore, stuff like throwing knives and parrying are included in the training tree, while riposting is in the swordsmanship tree, meaning that some of the stuff I learned from the tutorial are things that I can't even perform until I unlock them in the actual game. Again, I understand why this was done this way, but it doesn't always feel the greatest to have to unlock stuff that I already used before. I feel like right around level 8 is when I really started to get ready to shape Geralt into what I wanted him to be, which on the surface only exacerbates that feeling of been there, done that. If I were to sort things into tiers with my playstyle, I'd put stuff like riposting, health, vigor, and Quen into tier 1. Bonus damage, damage reduction, and Ard would be my tier 2 priorities. And stuff like adrenaline abilities, trap improvements, Yrden, and so on would be my tier 3 nice to have but not necessary talents. Now theoretically, this would be one of many builds. I would be able to build my Geralt to be more of a ranged, bomb-slinging, trap-deploying Witcher, or a more magic-centric, sign-wielding Witcher, maybe a pure swordsmanship-driven one, or an all-rounder that focuses a little on what I like best. But after my combat crisis with Letho, I realized that this game forces you to pick up certain talents if you care at all about making it through the game with your sanity. Ard becomes much more important than I previously gave it credit for, as it nearly always staggers enemies for a guaranteed attack. Vigor is insanely important, as running out causes you to do less damage overall. Igni's damage output is crazy and is probably a way to auto-win against enemies later on if you keep improving it. As much as I was enjoying Quen, its setup takes a while in tight situations, and if an enemy is so inclined to hit you from afar, it drops as quickly as you can cast it. Letho ruined my fucking life, ate my lunch, fucked my girl, and ultimately made me realize that this game requires you to feel like you're cheating to make it not suck to fight through. So as much as I want to sit here and say, wow, this game has some build variety, it really doesn't as much as you wish it would if you want to not suffer. at least as far as the early to mid-game goes. I would say that once you start to get the really good weapons in Chapter 2, your build doesn't really matter as much then. But still, you're going to have a lot easier time if it's built a certain way. I will say that at a surface glance, the most interesting bit about this whole system for me is the mutagens, which the game half explains through actual tutorial and half explains through practice. Basically, as you slay shit and quest along, you'll find mutagens. In the first game, these were primarily those unique monster ingredients which you brewed down to unlock new talents. In this game, they're a dime a dozen, and can be slotted instead without any brewing into certain talents across all 4 trees. There are 13 slots in total, and your potential upgrades hit pretty much every single stat that you can think of, from sword and sign damage to armor and vitality to crit chance and adrenaline generation. As a quick side note, adrenaline can only be used after investing into the heliotrope sign, berserk, or combat acumen talents, which are all later game talents that allow you to slow down time around you and either regen vigor or vitality faster, or perform group finishing insta-kill blows. But back to mutagens for now. So you have these mutagens, right? And the game tells you, hey, put these in these slots. And you're like, alright, cool, thanks for the heads up, Polish developer CD Projekt Red. I'll be sure to buy 50 Gwent kegs next expansion. They're confused why you would specifically call out their nationality, but they take it as a point of pride and let you carry on just slotting the best mutagens that you can find. Here's the rub with that. Every mutagen that you decide to slot is a permanent, irreplaceable upgrade. But that's okay, I slotted all of the rare greater mutagens that I could muster, and never went with anything lesser. Wow, great job. But then you look and you see this Impregnation 2 talent. Now surely that's gotta be the way to go, right? I mean, it enhances all of your mutagens to do more than they did before. Except you have to go down the alchemy tree for that with 6 of your talents. That's 6 levels that you're going down this tree. So I initially got suckered into thinking, hey, this has gotta be the way to go, right? I'll run down the alchemy tree, and then I'll head back for stuff in swordsmanship and the like. But there are 2 major issues with this. By the time I made it to Chapter 3, I had acquired 3 greater mutagens. 3 out of 13. So I found myself holding off on pressing for talents which I could slot these mutagens into, only to realize that these talents that I had put off grabbing before were vastly outperforming any bonuses that I was receiving from the mutagens themselves. It's not something that's really explained very well, and I think the game just expects you to notice it immediately when you start looking at potential builds. Thankfully, there is a way to respec your build in Chapter 3, so I wound up doing that and found myself with 13 more armor, 1 more damage, 150 more health, 2 more ARD damage, more vigor generation, and a note from CDPR telling me that my old build sucked. So yeah, fuck the alchemy tree. Besides you're my favorite. Alright, let's stop fucking around and finally get to the meat of this chapter. So after meeting up with Zoltan, Dandelion, and the rest of the crew, we talk politics for a while since Temeria is now in chaos as expected. A few potential names are thrown around as potential full test replacements before the port is attacked by the Kairin. Basically, this thing's a gigantic kraken-like creature, which happens to be our main hunt of the chapter. Assisting Geralt will be Sheila, who's one of the founding members of the Lodge of Sorceresses which Triss belongs to. I'll talk more about what's going on with her specifically later. But for now, she's already laid claim to the Kairin's bounty, as she wants its juicy monster bits for big sorcery shit involving an impotent king. So Geralt's kind of forced to work with her for this hunt. She's not the most pleasant individual, though to be fair, Triss isn't the most pleasant towards people who aren't Geralt. I think it's a sorceress thing. So after haggling to get the price of the Kairin bounty doubled, talking with Triss, who tells me that Sheila's a big meanie, gathering intel from an elf about a monster, and looking over a shipwreck caused by it, we set off to bag our Kairin.
Wait a minute.
What are you going to do?
Cast a simple diagnostic spell. It should answer a few questions.
What the fuck's a diagnostic spell? Hell yeah, magic! Whatever, let's fight this thing.
Ready?
Are you wearing makeup?
We all have our rituals.
The actual fight with Big Ugly is a mixed bag, but I overall wouldn't say that I enjoyed it. Basically, the whole thing has you dodging incoming tentacles and planting a Yurden sign to trap one of the glowing ones before hacking away at it. I did like how the game basically takes all of those timing cues that you've learned up until now and integrated them into the fight. What I didn't like was that the whole thing kind of played out like a big quick time event. There's no room for improvisation, no way to kill it with your own method. If you're a more focused sign user, you're not going to be able to blow it away with Igni or Ard. If you're a trap and item slinging user, you can't rely on items to take it down. And if you're wanting to just charge it with your sword, you can't just go up to it and hack away. You instead have to take it down with the way that it's scripted, which involves chopping away 3 of its glowing tentacles, and then playing out a QuickTime event and climbing the rubble off to the side and planting a bomb within it. There was a point when it knocked some rubble into its own body, and I saw that there was still that one last glowing tentacle pinned to the ground. The game had taught me at this point that I was cutting loose those weak points, so I ran towards it. This was the wrong move, as the electric barrier that Sheila put up to hold it in place meant that I was now getting fried. The problem is that I happened to make it to this point before another tentacle came down to block me off, meaning that I was trapped inside, and yeah, I died and had to repeat the whole fight. So yeah, not a super fun fight by any means, but whatever, it's done. We're now to head on to one of the floating prison barges which Loredo has trapped any suspected Scoia'tael and other convicts on to interrogate Yorveth's right-hand man. He claims that Letho unsurprisingly used Yorveth and his group for his own ends, and is now trying to get rid of Yorveth. It's how the right-hand man wound up on the prison barge, as Letho approached him to try to get him to turn on Yorveth. But more importantly for Geralt's backstory, the confrontation between the two took place in a garden where some of the last roses of remembrance in existence grow. These are powerful plants which can, help someone remember shit. Imagine that. Well, Geralt has still been struggling with his amnesia from the last game, and this sounds like the way to bring back those memories. I'm actually going to hold off on what exactly is going on here until pretty much the very end of this thing. Because from a casual playthrough perspective of someone who has no outside knowledge of The Witcher, none of this really makes complete sense until we get the full picture. Either way, we're off with Triss to pick some flowers. Leading up to the flower picking is some talk about the elves, and what they lost before the humans came along and forced them into the reservations of forests. It actually reminded me a bit of the human aggression which took place in Dragon Age, or rather I guess Dragon Age reminds me of it happening in The Witcher. Still, without looking too deep into the lore, it seems like the main difference to me is the resilience of the elves in The Witcher or the cruelty of the humans in Dragon Age. Whereas Dragon Age elves did fight back, they were eventually enslaved at a much greater rate as far as Ferelden goes. Temeria's elves seem to be putting up a lot bigger of a fight though. Then again, maybe if we gave it a couple hundred years more, the Scoia'tael might eventually find themselves in the same boat. Either way, we take out some bandit types before falling into a preserved elven bathhouse type thing. Geralt gets the option to either grab Triss like a bowling ball and bang her around the bath, or he can harness the power of a Reddit mod wizard and resist the urge to have sex. What's funny is that if he does resist Triss, he gains a buff that makes him more resistant to magic. I'd like to say that I managed to be a good Christian boy here, but I gotta see why CDPR used Triss to market this game.
Obviously a little bit more cautious. He doesn't want to throw anything because he knows that counter left cross will be coming back to him. But he's in the danger zone when he backs up here into the corner and against them ropes. He doesn't want to be there.
Legend has it the lovers' sighs are enchanted within these very stones, though only those in love can hear them.
Singing bushes, jabbering stones, elven hogwash.
They're putting on the ropes almost and then really loaded up with that big body shot. Oh, there's a right hand that moves him back. This is his best round.
You know, there's never any dick in these cutscenes. So we're coming up on our big decision, which will split the game into two completely different paths. On one hand, we have Yorveth's Scoia'tael, and on the other, we have Roach's commandos. When I played through the first time, I ran with Yorveth, mirroring my decision to stick with the non-humans in the first game. But the second game's decision is a lot more difficult for me due to quite a few different reasons. If we look at the surface level here, the Scoia'tael aren't a super morally good choice just given how much they let hatred determine their actions. They burnt down and raided entire human villages which fundamentally had nothing to do with the actions of Temeria. Roach's right-hand woman can attest to that when they killed off her village and took her captive as a plaything for the Scoia'tael's men. But it's not as if the humans are much better, as they've ultimately driven the non-humans into a corner and have continued to squeeze until they felt like they had no choice to become just as monstrous and hate-driven. There's no clear-cut good or bad side. And while I initially decided that non-humans never asked for this and that they were in the right to defend themselves, I'd have to say that at this stage they don't really have that same moral high ground with the shit that they've pulled since the initial conflicts. But the history of each side isn't even the toughest part for me, as the personalities of both Yorvith and Roach and the circumstances around the choice are probably the more pertinent reasons to choose my side here. I'll tap back into this train of thought in just a moment. So Triss splits off to prepare some spells, and Geralt heads back down to talk with Zoltan about Yorvith. Apparently Zoltan does know the elf, and was even asked to lead one of Yorvith's units, which makes Loredo's suspicions from earlier correct. Speaking of, Loredo is another big factor in the decision making here. And as Zoltan puts it, there are rumors that his constant money-mongering has placed him in a position to betray Temeria to work with the neighboring kingdom of Kedwin. These rumors prove to be true later, and it'll be another factor that applies only to one of the two main paths in this game. When we eventually make it to meet Yorvith, the elf stands strong against the claim that Letho betrayed his right-hand man, instead claiming that it was his right-hand man who betrayed him. That strong stance crumbles in about a matter of 5 seconds when Geralt tells him that it was the other way around. What a strong leader. So Yorvith continues to be standoffish, claiming that Foltest had to die because he endorsed aggression towards non-humans, and states that there is a king who would do well to put the non-humans back on equal footing with humankind. So what does a strong elf who's sure in his path do? Well, he offers to let Geralt tie him up and pretend that he's captured to get Letho to confess that he actually wants Yorvith dead. Solid plan, definitely one of a leader who's sure of himself. Well, it does pan out, as Letho immediately states that he wanted Yorvith dead, while also slipping in the fact that the two Witchers used to know one another. In fact, Letho claims that Geralt saved his life a while back, but obviously that doesn't seem to matter now. Soon Roach shows up and takes on the elves. I toss Yorvith his sword before moving in to take on Letho. Now, I might have very slightly touched on what Letho as a character has done to me as a real-life flesh-and-blood human, so I won't really bother describing the misery that I faced as the game taught me what I should really be doing with my life, and instead try to put a more positive spin on this whole interaction if that's at all possible. Because let's be honest, the fight with Letho does feel dramatic. It feels important. If I were gonna use a gamer word here, I'd say it feels epic. And then he kicks your ass 20 times and it feels, less epic. But the first impression was great. And truth be told, when I finally did start to pick up on what Letho was putting down, it felt like he was teaching me. You know how in Dark Souls there's that moment where the game plops a fucking asylum demon in front of you at the start of the game and calls you an idiot for playing it? Letho kind of feels like that too, except you can't run past him to find a real sword and come back and beat his ass. You have to do this shit right here and right now. You learn to use Ard if you weren't already. You learn that Igni can wholesale annihilate if it's upgraded. You learn that Yrden is great for stalling for time. And you learn that throwing your whole inventory is a viable strategy that will work and you should do it. But of course, all that positivity aside, I threw 20 bombs at Letho and downed him. So yeah, it doesn't feel good. What I really needed was more vigor, which is what I was gonna grab next, but I didn't before this fight because I thought, well, I should be fine for a bit still, I'm succeeding for now. Either way, we win the fight and then we lose the fight in the cutscene, which always feels good. Kinda makes me wish that this scene would have played if I lost to him, you know, like a scripted loss, and then maybe there could have been a different one if I won. Regardless, Letho tells Geralt that he's going to have Triss teleport him to Aedirn before throwing his sword away? I won't need this cumbersome thing anymore. Yeah, the town's rioting because of what happened between the Scoia'tael and Roach's men. Dandelion thinks it's probably incited by Loredo, who hasn't stepped in at all to stop it. It's funny because you would think that people wholesale razing buildings would, not be ideal due to possible spreading, but maybe they were responsibly lighting the fires. Either way, we get to scoping out Sheila's room where Triss was seen last. You would think the two would suspect Letho, but they're correct in diligently asking the brothel baron next door who happened to see what happened partially. Basically, an elf who's been living around town and Triss broke in to use Sheila's magic telephone to communicate with Philippa Eilhart, who's a whole other can of worms that I'm not really gonna touch on. After this, the cat house commander tells you that they stopped paying attention before they heard a commotion which resulted in the elf stumbling out of the joint alone. This whole line of plot isn't the greatest for a couple of reasons. For one, when you do catch up to the elf, he's like, yeah, I killed a human who was protecting Sheila's magic hot rod. And Geralt's like, why would you do that? And he's like, I don't know, Triss wanted me to help, I guess. Sure, I mean, might as well risk the humans feeling justified in a racial crusade because Triss wanted it. I kinda wish they would have revealed that she used Axii on him to get him to do this, but I don't really think that's the case here. Anyways, the second thing that's odd is that Letho literally said to Geralt,
Your witch is good with magic. Think she'll be able to teleport me to Aedirn?
And Geralt catches up to the elf and he says, what happened here? And the elf goes, well, it was the strangest thing. Basically, a man came in and told us,
Think she'll be able to teleport me to Aedirn?
Wow, what a twist. Alright, now it's decision time. Like I said, both sides are bad in their own way. Iorveth is a dickhead of an elf who believes that he has the moral high ground to do whatever he wants to get his way. His goal isn't horrible though, as his people do deserve equality. But he spits on those who have chosen to live and coexist with humans in their towns, which is a stupid way to proceed even if I understand why he thinks that way. He does treat Geralt a lot better after he tosses his sword to him during the fight previously, which is cool. But I think the biggest issue I have with Iorveth personally is how he allows himself to be blinded by his own rage. I mean, all Letho had to do was shake a head around in front of him for Iorveth to trust Letho even over his right-hand man. And then he has the gall to sit here and tell Geralt, well, of course I don't really trust Letho. I mean, I'm just using him because he's good at what he does. No, you're not, dude. He played you like a fucking fiddle. To be fair, he does admit that he fucked up, which definitely nets him points there. And maybe more importantly, his goal is to eventually establish an elven free state where humans and non-humans are equal, which is the reason that I went with him before. If that's true, then his goal is easily worth abandoning Roach for. Roach, on the other hand, has his own bundle of issues. He's not unfair to Geralt and is actually the reason Geralt made it out from La Valette. He's been good to him as far as that goes. But man, does Roach have a temper. And it always seems to come out and make things worse at the most inopportune times. Whipping a knife at someone who is trying to have a conversation instead of trying to talk things through has definitely got to be the biggest one. But the guy also sits here and waves his Blue Stripes badge around and expects people to bow. His men wound up desecrating an altar to the local population's god by using it for knife throwing practice, and Roach responded by getting in the people's faces and telling them to go fuck themselves basically. He's just not the best person as far as his pride goes, which puts him on somewhat equal footing with the flaws that Iorveth has. The next bit of info that affects my decision might be the biggest piece of the puzzle, as I do intend to carry this playthrough over to The Witcher 3 for that video eventually. When I was looking up some non-spoiler info about whose path meshes better with the events of the third game, it turns out that CDPR cut out Iorveth's role entirely. They had planned to do something with him, even getting a fully functional build of his quest into one of the builds of the game. But apparently they felt that the tone of his quest didn't suit the rest of the game, and decided to alter it to cut him entirely. For me, I'd say that having played through Iorveth's side once already, combined with the fact that he's not going to be involved in the next game, is going to be the deciding factor here. It also explains why I didn't intend to get into Philippa Eilhart as a character. There is one final bit of context which almost pushed me back the other way though, and that's what each person is doing right now at the end of Chapter 1. With Iorveth, you can basically tell him, hey, we need to go after Triss and Letho. And he's like, alright dude, let's do that right now. I mean, to be fair, he's not doing that just for Geralt, as he was already planning on dropping by Aedirn to meet with the woman that he deems to be the perfect candidate to lead the proposed nation of elves. But Roach has his hands full with Flotsam going to hell, and he insists on tidying up the place before leaving after the Kingslayer. From Geralt's point of view, I'd imagine that he wouldn't give a shit about Flotsam and would want to leave immediately, making Iorveth's route make way more sense. But let's be honest, it's never mattered how dire a situation is. Geralt is always willing to play dice poker or brawl the locals, to take up monster contracts and help random people with their nonsensical issues. As much as I'd like to sit here and pretend that choosing Iorveth means that he's going to charge straight to Triss with no detours, we all know that that's not the case unless you as a player choose to ignore everything else. So yeah, Roach it is just because I've never seen this angle before. I do want to be clear about something though. This is the reason to play the game. This whole game is a gigantic, stitched-together amalgamation of parts from various game genres, from its leveling system to its combat to dialogue options and minigames. It has quick-time events, it has bosses which can only be defeated one way and bosses that can be defeated multiple ways. It has a stamina system that uses the same resource pool to block and riposte as it does to cast spells. It has an alchemy system that allows you to only drink potions that you've brewed when you can sit down and meditate, forcing you to know what's ahead if you want to plan on resisting a certain element or fight specific enemies. It is fundamentally fucked up mechanically in a way that I don't think that I've seen from any other video game, but at the same time I'm kind of having fun with it, so there's definitely something going right. And that something is the agency that you have with a fully voiced character. Geralt is obviously one of the cooler characters that you can play as in a game, and that definitely helps. But you can still guide him. You can choose which paths that he takes, which decisions that he makes, whether he's pragmatic or optimistic, whether he cares more about coin or more about people. Fundamentally, he's still gonna be the same person, but a lot of his actions shape who he is in my mind. And the actions are something that the player chooses a lot of the time. So even when I was a bit downtrodden after getting my asshole gaped by Letho, I still looked forward to seeing where this whole entire other path to the game was going to take me. It's one of the saving graces that make this game worth playing, and I hope that I don't eat those words because I can't imagine that the devs just dropped the ball with the writing of Roach's path. So this whole thing kicks off with Roach laying out the plan to take down Loredo once and for all, who's been confirmed at this point to be working with Kedwin. The whole thing involves Roach's right-hand woman Vess disguising herself as a hooker to accompany Loredo for the night. Geralt, on the other hand, has the job of sneaking in and taking Loredo out. This involves another optional stealth section which isn't as bad as the first part of the game. I make it through to Loredo's mother, who is in the middle of manufacturing fist tech. She tries to take out Geralt before he lops her head off. Then he grabs her key and sneaks through the rest of the manor. This whole time there are these cutscenes which show what's happening between Vess and Loredo at the same time that Geralt is creeping his way up. Right before I get to the top, it seems that Loredo is about to give Vess the business as she's tied to the wall. And then when I make it in, oh no, it's a trap, watch out! How the fuck did he know I was coming? Like, I figured if I failed the stealth section, maybe this would be the outcome, but again, it doesn't matter as the scene is set in stone. It just seems kinda silly to have all of these optional outcomes for certain quests and player agency with just about everything else, only to have these mandatory cutscenes where it didn't matter if I fought every guard on my way up here or made it up without a peep. Anyways, wanna see what that Loredo fight looks like right after the bullshit with Letho? Yeah. I mean, to be fair, I'm actually glad that Loredo is just a bloated punching bag when compared to Letho. And it makes a lot of sense from a story perspective. But yeah, it's almost laughable after that last big fight. So we kill Loredo and find this elven woman who's trapped in his room. He's had her here for, I don't know, let's say 9 or so months? Give or take. Yeah, she goes into labor as we're trying to walk her out of here. After killing the rest of Loredo's men, the woman gives birth to a boy before slitting her wrists. It's heartbreaking, but the torment that she must have had to endure had to have taken its toll. We leave the boy with an elven male nearby before taking the boat up the river to Edirn and straight into chapter 2. Alright, before I continue to jump into the next chapter, let's talk about balls. I gotta say, that's not a transition I was expecting to say ever in my life. But I've been told that roughly 50% or so of the population has balls, so we might as well start with that. Unless you've gotten your sack waxed in recent history, you may have noticed some hair growing out of parts of it. Thankfully, with the Lawnmower 4.0, you don't have to worry about drizzling wax onto your nuts to yank that ball hair out. Holy shit, thank God my neighbors speak German. Right, where were we? Ah yeah, ball hair. With the Lawnmower 4.0 waterproof electric body trimmer, more painful operations are a thing of the past. Nicks and cuts in some of your most sensitive bits have always been a battle with this type of thing. But Manscaped has overcome that barrier by implementing what they've dubbed advanced skin-safe technology. I believe there's a trademark in that name. When you're done shaving down the boys, you can also make use of Manscaped's Weed Whacker nose and ear hair trimmer, their anti-chafing boxer briefs, or their ball deodorant. Look, I know this isn't the most comfortable subject for some of you out there, but a lot of people are interested in keeping themselves groomed and tidy, and Manscaped fulfills that desire in spades. So if you want to keep yourself cleaned up without having to worry about doing anything drastic, I encourage you to head over to manscaped.com and get 20% off and free international shipping when you use my code TheSaltFactory. Hell, they'll even throw in a pair of those anti-chafing briefs and a travel bag for free when you use the code. Thanks, guys. So Chapter 2 begins interestingly.
I speak of magic, the kind of spells that win wars, thousands incinerated in seconds. Power, destruction, annihilation!
Enter the leader of Kedwin, King Henselt. Accompanied by Sheila and the excited mage Deathmold, the good king is trying to sweep up as many borders as he can with Samaria falling into chaos, which explains his presence here in Edirn. Unfortunately for him, a peasant woman from Edirn has risen in fame after supposedly slaying a dragon, and she now stands alongside Demavend's surviving son against Henselt. If I had chosen Yorvet's path, I would have been working with this Saskia lady to end racism and all that. But as things stand, I actually wind up piloting Henselt through a negotiation where he winds up dueling Saskia in a one-on-one. Dude fucking clobbers her too. Midway through the battle, someone tries to break them up before Henselt uses a full heat bar to pick him up and bash his skull in on this very average and normal looking stone structure. Well, it turns out that this was precisely the requirement to awaken a long dormant curse which raises the dead, fancy that. It's an interesting setup though, to be completely honest. I'd have rather seen how the events played out without a curse resurrecting the fallen soldiers of the past. I mean, you have a pretty solid introduction into these political spheres of influence colliding and colluding, and then the dead rise and the prince who Saskia was accompanying just dies. Like not even in a cutscene or anything, you just happen to find his body as you run away. It's crazy because he has a much bigger role on Yorvet's path, and there's this huge quest line which plays out that could wind up with him being on the throne for Edirn. I mean, Nilfgaard just rolls over him eventually, but still, I guess I'm getting ahead of myself anyways. So Geralt and Roach are showing up at the front gates of Henselt's camp right around the time that these negotiations are going down. And this dude at the front gate starts stammering like a Scooby-Doo character about Geralt being the big bad Kingslayer. Roach tries to calm him down, but this guy is just freaking out at this stage. Geralt isn't even paying attention because he realized that the portal to hell just opened nearby. Roach continues to try to dissuade this guy from unleashing all one of his crossbow bolts at Geralt before he just takes off towards where the king is. The two forces meet up and Geralt begins witchering his heart out as the dead keep popping up. Eventually the devs decide, hey, that shit with Triss earlier was cool, let's do that again. And we wind up taking a very long walk with Deathmold at the center of our protection detail. There are a couple points where he stops and we have to fight off a few wraiths, but for the most part he's just got this big bug zapper in the middle and you don't have to do much fighting at all. When all is said and done and we make our escape back to camp, the jackass from before talks to us like he never sat here and threatened to shoot Geralt about 10 different ways when he first arrived. In fact, he says something along the lines of, well, if you vouch for him, Roach, he's probably fine.
What the fuck?
A lot happens at once from here, as a whole ass area is thrown at you at once, complete with quests, side quests, and miscellaneous stuff. The important bits glean the information that this curse is delaying Henselt from being able to seize the area that he was planning to seize, and that he needs Geralt to lift it in order to continue. Additionally, the king will help Geralt clear his name even if he doesn't manage to take down Letho, which is a nice bonus. The reason for this curse even existing was because Henselt decided to burn his court witch to death when she decided to behave like your average D&D wizard and friendly fired a whole battalion with a slew of fireballs. I mean, she killed off the enemy too, but yeah. Everyone is always mad at the wizard, and for good reason.
Many thanks. At first I thought, go away, Emo. But now I see you're a good fellow.
Chapter 2 side quests are a bit more of the same, with a couple of fun ones sprinkled in. You've got a contract, you've got your poker, your brawls, your brothel whores, your arm wrestling.
They say blacksmiths are strong. I say they're fat pussies.
Yes!
Fat pussy. Fat pussy.
The side quests themselves are actually a bit lacking, which is kind of surprising after the first chapter. There's a single contract on rot fiends, some notes which need translating, and a mystery surrounding more names that start with M than Elden Ring. That last one is interesting, though not nearly as much as the earlier side quest that I described with the looters who came back to the mental hospital. Though I will say that this new quest plays off of that old quest rather expertly. Basically, you wind up investigating a hut by the sea which has evidence of 3 dead siblings and their father. When you rest at the beach at night, you can encounter the wraiths which have been haunting a soldier back in town. They tell you that the guy in town is their brother, and that he murdered them. After that earlier quest, my first thought was that this was going to be another situation where I'm going to help the monster gain revenge. But after bringing the soldier to the beach and choosing to kill the wraiths, he tells you that his father was the one who murdered his sisters, and that he murdered his father to get revenge. If you wound up letting the wraiths kill him, they laugh at you and tell you that you're an idiot for believing them, which only works as well as it does because of that previous quest. It's pretty neat, though again, nothing groundbreaking. What's odd is that you'd think that there would be more side stuff to do. I mean, there's 2 separate camps away from the main area, and then the wilds themselves, which are a little sparse. Either way, to make up for the lack of side stuff, the main quest route actually has quite a few branching paths revolving around a conspiracy theory running amok in Henselt's ranks. The Melvin from before, Deathmold, dances around this idea a bit, basically stating that there are soldiers who are plotting something related to the blood curse that was unleashed upon the area. Their identifying symbol are square coins, not a sign and countersign or a verbal passcode of sorts. I have to imagine that the reason for this was specifically because of what the court witch Sabrina said before she was burnt at the stake. The curse that she uttered as she died involved something along the lines of traitorous men with square coins appearing in Henselt's ranks. And while you could say that this might have been an allegory for something, Henselt's dumbass superstitious men more than likely took it literally and decided to adopt the square coin as their symbol to know who was on their side. One of these quests to gain a square coin and infiltrate the conspirators involve Geralt backing up a guy in a duel, which can eventually lead to a bit where you can sleep with Vess. Another one involves Geralt looking for a drunk guy and is by far the easiest. And the last of these is one that I actually did, but without the information of where to use the coin, I have no idea what to do with it. So I wound up getting a second coin from the drunk guy instead, who tells me how and where to use it to infiltrate the traitor's ranks. This whole string of quests feels especially mailmanish. I don't know how else to describe them because they just aren't horribly interesting to me. Because the main part of this plot has been revealed already. The king burnt this woman at the stake because she killed a bunch of his men with fireballs. She cursed him, it was activated, and now we gotta break it. But to do that, we need very specific items. So the bulk of this chapter more or less is gathering information on those items. And sure, there are some amusing bits here and there. The annoying drunk guy, the unrelated murder mystery, a dude who sends me on a vision quest. But at the end of the day, I'm kinda just spending a couple of hours running back and forth from the main camp to the wilds. I mean, it's cool to a degree to think about the idea that there are now these really superstitious people because of Sabrina cursing the king. There are those that believe that they have to appease her, those that praise her as a god, those who deny her having any power, and those who are profiting from her death. But it's also slow, and we linger on the idea of grabbing these items for way too long for my tastes. Ironically, I'm pretty sure the Yorveth route where you wind up in Vergen is just as bad, if not worse, for backtracking specifically. Of course, this is all off of my memory, which can be faulty. But I do remember that a lot of the Vergen quests took place around a city about the size of Flotsam and had its own degree of backtracking with less open wildland area but more dungeon-type mini areas. But with that route, Saskia winds up poisoned. And it actually involves its own little fetch quest brigade, sure, but it folds in a lot of intrigue when Demiven's son becomes the prime suspect in the poisoning. I don't know, maybe I just prefer that route more so far. Either way, we continue gathering information and one of the items until it becomes clear that the rest of them is on the other side of the fog in Vergen. On my way out of the camp, I scoop up Zoltan, who is shockingly not too fond of the rampant racism that he's faced being in the human camp. I can also talk to an elf who's been tied up, and he describes 2 of Letho's men, Serad and Ox, as being overheard talking about the Redanian forces showing up soon so that they could depart from the elves to presumably go with them. Once we cross the fog, Item Quest 2011 is back on, though this time with a bit more fun attached, thankfully.
Will I have you, Chiefy? Will I plow and have you? Why, I'll make you fucking commander, you cocksucker!
Yeah, this side of the fence actually has a lot more colorful characters. Though I guess there's always the drunken lads from the Kedwin side to fall back on, but again, I kind of found them a little annoying. I do like that this chapter embodies the idea that Geralt isn't going to pick up a sword for whoever the player desires him to help and just start swinging wildly with no thought, as bridging the gap between the 2 camps really puts him firmly back into the idea that he's here for himself and his friends. He's here to clear his name, grab his girl, recover his memories, and hopefully accomplish it all without anyone close to him getting too much into trouble. He's not the hated enemy of Yorveth, just like he doesn't have to cut down Roach if he went the other way with this chapter. So now we're grabbing stuff on the Vergen side of things. The whole exploration bit here is basically a downsized version of where you would be had you chosen Yorveth as your waifu. And I think it probably serves to show a first-time player, hey look, you could have been here. But at the same time, I know how much more sprawling this area is if you do wind up on that side. And as the area stands now, it's kind of just a very long walk with little going on. You get one merchant that they stick into every area for some reason, which sells the garbage fruits and veggies. And that's about all you get in terms of optional NPCs which you can interact with within the walls of Vergen, as the rest of it is closed off by a gate. Actually, with as welcoming as the people are here, especially in the form of this dwarf who knows and loves Geralt, you would think that you would be able to jump ship to this side as an option. I mean, I guess that would be tougher to figure out from a game dev point of view, but it would have been cool to just flip-flop here. Either way, I wind up spelunking and looting a crypt for the standard of the Dun Banner, which starts with me knocking down walls in this catacomb and unwrapping bodies. This is completely optional, but I will say that the body that I happened to choose had a decent silver sword called Fate on it. So I spent a lot of time unwrapping and looting these bodies, only to wind up with nearly all of them having mundane shit on them like wire and iron ore. I would have given up on unwrapping them had I hit like 3 in a row with wire on them, because wraiths do occasionally pop up after opening these forbidden Christmas presents. And like I noted before, you have to wait a few seconds between fights in order to start looting again, which is annoying. The standard itself is guarded by its last color bearer, which quizzes me when I lie to him about being in the Dun Banner. Then I run back through all of the shit that I ran through to get to the catacombs to find Zoltan clear on the other side of Vergen in some tunnels. This was about the time in the game that I realized something that was kind of important about the leveling system, that it hardly matters in terms of damage output. I mean, yeah, it's great for vigor and vitality and stuff like that, but I would say that 80 to 90% of my damage output is almost directly correlated to the weapon that I purchase or craft, making talents affecting that damage output nearly meaningless by comparison. There's a DLC quest right around this area with the tunnels which involves me turning in 80 harpy feathers to a guy who claims to be working for a collector. The only other DLC quest besides this one so far involved the troll who lost his wife to the mercenaries. Which is funny because that one actually had some depth in terms of what you could decide to do with the troll, the mercs, and even the troll's wife's head. But this one's just like, I don't know, kill a bunch of monsters and collect their loot, I guess? And then again...
Pretty warm for this time of year.
It is colder usually, isn't it?
The mages must be up to something.
So the tunnels are just another mini dungeon which has us fighting through monsters to get to Zoltan and Saskia. Saskia knows that the curse is specifically on Henselt, but wants it lifted anyways to free the souls of the dead which continue to fight in the field. Which means we only need one more bit here to lift the curse, a spearhead which belonged to the knight who stabbed Sabrina while she was tied up. This spearhead has been the stupidest thing to track down, as it involves you talking to a relic dealer in the main camp, then running to the other end of the map to talk to this worshipper of Sabrina who also happens to be the guy who stabbed her with his spear. Then going on a vision quest, then running back to the relic dealer who supposedly had it all along and tells you that he lost it playing dice poker and that it wound up in Yorveth's hands. And now it turns out that fucking Yorveth lost it playing dice against someone else too. So now we gotta go find this dwarf from the start of the area and play him in dice for it. Thankfully that is where the string ends, as we nab the spearhead off of him along with a sword and a cloak. Then we head back to the main camp to find Roach, who's gotten himself into another fight in our absence. He claims that a woman came through the fog with a jade figurine that looks suspiciously like Triss. The figurine looks like her, not the woman. When she said something to the Nilfgaardian soldiers who seemed to be waiting for her, they attacked Roach and his men before getting put down. The woman with the Triss figurine ran off to the Nilfgaard part of the camp before escaping since we took too long to go single file through the doors to the camp. So we're back at square one as far as catching up to our magical companion goes, as Roach isn't willing to fire up his ship because he doesn't want to invoke the ire of the mighty King Henselt. Imagine if that figurine was a random object though and had nothing to do with Triss. I don't even know how you get a good enough look at a figurine to tell, oh yeah, that's definitely Triss. But yeah, I guess Roach has good eyesight. So we head into this mini game where we have Henselt drawing a rune on the ground with powder. I did not look through my shit to see what the pattern was, so I kind of brute forced it for a bit before realizing what this thing was probably going to look like. The goal here is to reenact the scene from 3 years ago, except this time Henselt's gotta kill Sabrina before she gets the curse off. It's actually a pretty cool scene, and I am glad that it eventually led to this. I still would have liked it if we saw what would have happened when the two forces met and began brawling without a curse interrupting them, but this is still a pretty fun outcome regardless.
Curses, there's hundreds of them!
Calm down, Your Majesty. We're protected by the magic runes. The ghosts won't get past the barrier.
I'm not afraid of people, but those plowing creatures have begun to bother me.
You're safe if you stay within the runes.
What should I do?
Stay within the runes.
After Henselt re-murders the witch, part 1 of our curse dispelling process is over. And it's on to the second phase where we need to dispel the battlefield of ghosts separating the two forces who are at odds here. Of course, Henselt takes his sweet time giving you the amulet which you need to accomplish this feat, eventually calling you over at midnight to talk with you. It's here that it's announced by a messenger that Radovid of Redania has decided that his wife Ada, the daughter of Foltest, should be the next in line for the Temerian throne as the surviving heir, which would actually be a cool consequence of her being alive after the first game. But then Henselt calls her a monster since she was once under the curse of being a Striga, and refuses to even acknowledge her right to the throne, which is mirrored by all of the nobles in the next chapter, effectively rendering Radovid's marriage useless. But we'll talk more about that later. Anyways, after Henselt dismisses Ada's right to the throne, he cowers in the corner as a pair of assassins try to attack him. Yeah, kind of a weird time to attack considering that Geralt was there, but alright. I never really did get into Henselt's character all that much, as he did kind of come off as a badass who was willing to duel the so-called Dragon Slayer in a one-on-one duel at the start of this chapter. But after that, he's been a pretty arrogant guy who's shit himself whenever something unexpected or supernatural has happened. God, I miss Foltest. Anyways, Geralt takes out one of the assassins before the other gets headed off by Sheila. Apparently, the entire camp being raised to alert status as their king has been attacked wasn't enough to catch the guy because he's a witcher. And those only ever get caught when they allow themselves to be. Deathmold gets fucking rigid at the thought of performing forbidden necromancy in order to raise the assassin that did die from the dead and get them to spill the truth as to why they attacked the king just now. So our next task is assisting him with that. So we dive into the assassin's memories, who turns out to be Ox, meaning his partner who escaped would be Serret. This sequence is cool, but also kind of annoying. You start out by just walking through an area of the map with harpies everywhere. I mean, I imagine this was to get you used to the controls of Ox, but his controls are just click, click, click to attack. So this first part is completely unnecessary, as it doesn't really even reveal that much besides that this is Serret and Ox, which could have easily been discerned later. You then head through a trapped part of the tunnel system. And if you don't follow Serret correctly, you get booted out and you have to retry from the beginning of the sequence, which is not the most fun punishment. Honestly, the gameplay isn't riveting enough to warrant a whole sequence where you play as someone else, and I would have preferred a long cutscene instead. Either way, the meat of the information that we gather here points towards Sheila as being the person who ordered the assassination of Demavend, which is out of left field with the limited knowledge the player has of Sheila at this stage. It also explains why she noped the fuck out when Deathmold even brought up the idea of necromancy. And you would think that she's probably long gone now that it was raised as an option here. Now there is one more section to the flashback here, which again is an optional stealth section. You would think that it wouldn't be optional, but if you do fail it, Geralt just snaps out of it and spills the beans to Deathmold. Which makes complete sense instead of him going, wait, I want to see what it's like to die from my own hands. It'll be like sucking my own dick, kind of. The funny bit is that I failed this section because I was so used to the right click being the knockout button, but I wasn't ready for the kill button to be left click. But whatever. We head to the former hideout of the Kingslayers while cutting our way through the new hit indie folk metal band Two Gargoyles and a Golem. At the end of the line lies Serret, who stays alive just long enough to mention that Sheila did this to him to erase the evidence, which she somehow left him alive, so great job there. Either way, Serret talks to Geralt as a friend from his past, and laments the fact that they were trying to stop the Wild Hunt and that he didn't see that through. Which again, I'm gonna lump all of this kind of Geralt's past stuff together at the end because it just makes more sense there. Now it's time to lift that curse once and for all. which has us going through another rousing round of running all the way from one side of the map and back, seeing as fast travel wasn't invented until this year when Elden Ring came out. When we do make it to the battlefield, we wind up bouncing between taking control of various soldiers from the Aedirnian and Kaedweni armies, which is a mix of okay and pretty cool. The parts where I have to use someone who can't roll, doesn't have a lunge, and no access to magic, potions, or oils are pretty humdrum. But when the game mixes it up and allows me to take control of men who are trying to dodge arrows and fireballs, I have a lot better time because it's more interesting to me than playing as a worse Geralt. Even so, the actual gameplay is not very amazing. At one point you do get to play as Geralt against a beefed up Draugr, which is cool to look at, but ultimately I have no idea what it's trying to do most of the time. It's just kind of making movements, and I hit it, and sometimes it hits me with catapult stuff. Again, Ard saves the day, as I now have enough vigor to spam through him pretty handily. What is amazing about this whole thing is the setting, as the battlefield rages between these two forces. And it feels like a real battle. It looks really cool. At one point it's revealed that the sorceress Sabrina contacted some other members of the Lodge of Sorceresses to tell them that Henselt was on the verge of victory. This is when they gave her the okay to rain hellfire down onto the field in order to prevent Kaedwen from outright winning despite Sabrina supposedly being on their side. Sabrina tries to push her luck by insisting that Henselt send his now terrified men to push in and claim victory. But Henselt has none of it, as he instead sentences Sabrina to death and the Curb Your Enthusiasm theme plays. When Geralt awakens from his curse-lifting foray, it's been 3 days. Henselt chewed out Deathmold for not informing him of the conspiracy or the fact that Sheila was working with the Kingslayers, and demanded that he figured out the conspiracy ASAP. This meant that Deathmold was now torturing and hanging anyone that he could get his hands on that might have the slightest iota of who's behind these square coins. Meanwhile, Roach went to do some reconnaissance and has just returned from doing so. And the battle for Vergen has literally just begun after the nobles held up Henselt's march for a few days. You would think that Geralt would immediately head for that clusterfuck, but he instead goes to find Roach since he's nearby, I guess. Well, it looks like Roach is the one who started the conspiracy under Foltest's orders 3 years ago. He's since been gathering intel on Henselt and his campaign in order to ensure that he didn't try to make any alliances with Nilfgaard or the like during his reign. Well, it turns out that Deathmold has rounded up one of his OG conspirators, one who knows enough to finger Roach in all of this, so it's up to us to stop him from getting answers from the guy. Well, turns out we're too late, as Deathmold has already figured out the Blue Stripes' involvement. Check out these insta-kill stun scenes which teleport me away from the battle to a default location to take place. I do have to say that it's a bit odd fighting these men as if they were common bandits. I mean, up until this point, Geralt has been in the company of them for who knows how many days and nights, solving their smaller issues while taking on one of the largest curse-involved issues in history according to Deathmold, who claimed that there were only 6 of this magnitude, and only 1 of which had been lifted. While I don't see Geralt choosing the dark side and letting Roach perish here while he goes on his way, I do think that a cutscene with one of these men or Deathmold himself stating that the king has spared Geralt from his sentencing due to his heroic deeds would suffice to properly show that these men that we're fighting don't do so willingly, and that Geralt was the one who chose to fight with Roach here. Anyways, we stumble into a tent with all 12 of Roach's commando clones hanged. The only one left alive is Vess, who runs over crying before hugging, Geralt for some reason. I did miss the part where Geralt can sleep with Vess because I never went through the whole fighting pit route, so I looked up the scene for scientific research purposes, and what's funny about it is that it uses the exact same aftermath audio as when Geralt is smoking a pipe in the whorehouse tent. Like you can hear him drawing from the pipe when he kisses Vess. Hell yeah. Vess regales a tale of Roach's people being invited to a feast before they accuse the Stripes of treason. In her flashback, the king forced himself on her before letting her live while they hanged the rest of her unit. After she departs to swing the boat around, Geralt tells Roach in no minced words that Vess is lying. This was probably a very poor choice of words, seeing as Henselt later confirms that he did in fact force himself on Vess. I know Roach never counters Geralt's statement with a, "What do you mean?" like a normal human being would, and instead claims that he can vouch for her with his life. But the fact that nothing else ever comes from this line of dialogue in terms of Vess being a traitor or something along those lines tells me that Geralt meant that Vess was lying about Henselt simply letting her go, as she probably didn't want to tell the two that she was assaulted. It's kind of a bad bit of writing from the devs, with this line not being expanded at all beyond pointing towards the idea that Geralt might have been suspecting of her being a traitor to the Blue Stripes or whatever.
Not easy. Run! Old man coming. Old man rip apart you.
Calm down, you fat pussy.
So we push on through the tunnels, which I stubbornly refuse to use a cat potion for, even though I should have, before running into Deathmold and his hired band of mercenaries who's headed by Chris Pratt. This is the worst fight that I've fought in a very long time, as Deathmold has straight up iframes for well over half the battle. He can be damaged down to a point where he teleports behind a mysterious blue wall of fuck off, but he always rejoins to teleport around and cast Quen. So that means that we have to take out his mercs instead, which involves Chris Pratt deciding that he's done taking damage and just crouches every here and there. You'd think that he'd have his helmet on, but I guess he was just too cool for that. Eventually we take out all of the men, and Deathmold continues to harvest the power of Goro Majima to be everywhere at once. I wind up having to spam Ard to get him to flop, and even then sometimes he's just not ready to take damage. When I do eventually get him low enough again, he pulls a glasses from the first game and fucks off through a portal. What a rewarding fight. So we roll out of the tunnels and straight into the thick of the fighting, as Henselt has unleashed his full wrath onto Vergen. Zoltan points us towards Sheila before Roach's fat ass busts through the wooden bridge.
Fuck!
Good recovery though. Well, Geralt takes a look at that 5-foot gap and says fuck this shit before going around from Roach's landing spot. We do get the option to choose between reinforcing Yorveth or heading to Sheila as the game puts it, but you can actually do both. Going to Yorveth yields, I don't know, him being like, ah man, we lost everything, and then disappearing from the games entirely. Like that's it, it's the last line of dialogue that he has from here on out unless you play through the other side of the game. When you head to Sheila's instead, she just happens to be teleporting as you walk through the door. Oh no, if only I hadn't seen Yorveth, surely she wouldn't have been just now leaving. Geralt doesn't even flinch, and soon King Henselt comes bearing down on him like he was the one who orchestrated the treason in his ranks. After some combat, Roach comes in to fuck the good king up. This brings us to our main decision of Roach's path in Chapter 2. To let the Berserk soldier kill the king, or to spare the king. It's a very tough choice, honestly, as both sides have considerable merit. If we let Henselt live, Kedwin will overtake Eddern, but will also stabilize, I imagine. As fat of a pussy that Henselt can be, he's proven himself capable of organizing deals, taking land, holding what he owns, and overall getting things done beyond the occasional blood curse fuck-up. It makes sense that bringing stability to the land would be better for the people rather than plunging it into more fighting for God knows how long. The northern kingdoms are in the middle of pulling together or suffering a schism at the hand of neighboring countries all ready to divvy it up and claim the land for themselves. And Henselt is one of the few who can keep the peace for at least a little longer. On the other hand, Henselt is a treacherous leech, one who would sooner turn on people like Geralt without so much as a thought as to how he even got his armies to this point. He's a horrible rapist and a pig-headed shit stain, but I think that's what this story has done rather well at conveying. As much as I simped for Foltest, the former king wasn't without his faults. He was a fantastic ruler, but he was also very flawed. And the closer that you get to these kings, the more that you learn about them. And the more that you learn about them, the more that Letho's killing spree starts to make sense. Killing Henselt deprives the world of another complete dickhead in charge, and paves the way for a better method of ruling in a way. At least, that's the ideology here. But in reality, these countries need kings. And a world where regicide is the answer to jackasses in charge is a world with no rules. At least in the Witcher universe. Hell, in our universe as well. I mean, unless they were killed all at once, then maybe something new could be born? I don't know, this is all hypotheticals which are way above my pay grade, and it's a lot to think about when the game throws this decision at you. So I go with my gut on this one, and I let Roach gut Henselt. Chapter 2 is, well, it's a mix of good plot and bad gameplay. I mean, for all intents and purposes, the actual combat and the like hasn't shifted much from Chapter 1 beyond me gaining more vigor and better weapons, but the main beef that I had was the sheer amount of walking from point to point. At first I assumed that this part of the map from Roach's side was about the same size if not a little bigger than Flotsam and its outer areas, which might still be true. The issue is that a lot of the questing involved had me running from one end of the map to the other repeatedly with nothing to keep my interest along the way. And I'm not saying that monsters needed to spawn constantly to keep me amused, as that would have been just as agitating if not more so. But I think the best thing that could have been done to keep me occupied with my traveling was plain old rockstar style conversation. Whether it be talking with Roach about his conspirator as we run to Deathmold, or an internal monologue about what Geralt is thinking during his questing. That kind of dialogue really does wonders to keep the player from realizing that they're just running from point A to point B over and over. It's the only thing that I can think of beyond an actual fast travel system like The Witcher 1 had, and or some kind of horse like The Witcher 3 winds up going with. Although the whole thing dragged on for far too long for my tastes, I did love the climax and the thoughts that it provoked. It really elevates this idea that Letho and his crew may not be the bad guys here, and that there's still more mystery to solve in order to put all of this into perspective. It sets up Chapter 3 as the final chapter, one that promises a bombastic conclusion. If you had only played on this side of the game's branching paths, the conclusions that you've drawn so far promise to be answered in this chapter as they should be. It has us sailing down to the mountainous region of Loch Muine, where a meeting between rulers, sorceresses, and any nobles of importance is about to take place to try to figure out what to do with these kingdoms. Nilfgaard is here because Henselt invited them before he had an unfortunate accident. Redania is here with Radovid at the helm, along with the Order of the Flaming Rose, which have pivoted to serving Redania instead. John Natalis is here, the bald fuck. A shitload of sorceresses are here to try to grab more power and create a new world order. And Deathmold is still doing his Disney villain thing of taking one bite of an apple and throwing it on the ground, while generally behaving like a Metalocalypse character. He makes it clear that he's not done here yet as he traps Foltest's bastard daughter behind a magic cage in part of the ruins that make up Loch Muine. I do wonder why these men listen to him though. It's not as if he's king now. Roach and Geralt have made it to the city, and Roach parts from our boy to go meet up with Radovid. That means it's side stuff time. Loch Muine is fucking big, at least as far as the cities and the rest of this game goes. Well, I guess if we consider Flotsam and the camp that we came from as cities, seeing as we never really got to delve into Vergen on this path. Still, there's tons to it, and it's not the greatest, because the map is just not accurate. I mean, this place is a ruins, right? So sure, there's gonna be some shit out of place, but my god, the amount of times that I looked at the map and went, I can go through here, only to find a collapsed entrance or just a wall, was way too many. But either way, the monster contract here is for gargoyles, which involves me going to 3 separate locations and figuring out which order to erase these runes. This was probably my favorite set of Bash the Baddies quests from this game, as it had you figuring out what each of these symbols represented, then reading a book nearby to figure out which order to erase the runes, and then erasing them for a pretty damn good treasure. So if it said something like, "A dolphin travels high above the sea. It was late for dinner, but who cares, that bitch is looking fabulous like an oil painting," you would then know to go animal, then sky, then time, then art. You know, I gotta hand it to the devs here. Contracts in this game are done well. They're not so much about, hey, bring me 12 Drowner sphincters, and more about performing specific rituals to keep monsters away. They really make me feel like the game's title. I forgot what the term is exactly, but it's something to do with witches, I think. Either way, this is about it already in terms of side content that is only started and finished in Chapter 3, as weird as that sounds. The only other stuff involved the final bouts of dice poker and arm wrestling, which go about the same as always.
I'd like to play dice poker. Do you play dice? I want to play dice. Let's play dice.
When I say stuff that starts here, I mean that there are a few quests that actually start in previous chapters and end here. For example, the notes that we found in this abandoned hut bring us to our guy who can respec us or that we can kill for a very good weapon. It also leads us into a recipe for another great weapon. And the final quest to my knowledge in terms of side questing starts in Chapter 1 and involves a set of armor which I never really bothered with. All in all, I'd say that the devs definitely dropped the ball with side questing in the last chunk of this game. It's interesting because I had some great stuff to say about it at the start, as everything seemed a lot more developed in terms of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 had some traveling issues but was by far the bulkiest chapter in the game. While the side quests did drop a bit in quality, they weren't bad and I did have my share of fun with them. But the only thing Chapter 3 has going for it in terms of side content is the gargoyle stuff. Though completing the others for armor and weapons is definitely something you might find yourself wanting to do. So let's go meet with Radovid and get this show on the road. Radovid not only looks completely different, his personality has changed a bit as well. In the first game he was a lot more cunning, but at the same time he was willing to meet Geralt with no protection around him. He was a bit more lively, more driven to track down the Nilfgaardians who murdered his father, and to forcibly push peace and order into his lands. He was this interesting king in the shadows, one who kept his ear to the ground and cleverly weaved his way into the marriage with Princess Ada by showing up when Foltest needed him most. He knew that Geralt was pivotal to his plotting, and clued the Witcher in as a capable bishop to be used in his game of chess. Now Radovid is a lot more cautious than he used to be. He asks about Geralt being around during Henselt's recent foray, and basically confirms that he knows that these two had something to do with Henselt's death. Geralt can take the blame here, but it doesn't seem to really matter either way. The point is that Radovid is much more wary about how he speaks to Geralt now, as he lays out his new plan to utilize Foltest's other daughter Anais to bring unity to Temeria by declaring her queen. You can't blame the guy's guarded demeanor when there are rumors circulating about Geralt chopping down kings like trees, especially when Geralt flat out takes the fault for Henselt's death. Either way, the problem that these two are now facing is that Deathmold has taken Anais hostage, and Radovid states very directly that the reason why Roach and Geralt haven't been strung up is because he needs the two to free her. We're going to touch a little bit more on Radovid's behavior later when we get to the big meeting. So that's our task now, as we set out to discuss our options. This is when the game springs one last surprise side quest on you, which is the lengthiest bit of DLC addition that spans an entire area outside of Loch Muin. Basically, Roach had a spy here who was to watch over Anais and
Boosie.
She did so, but got herself into hot water which we can conveniently bail her out of. Roach has better shit to do, so I'm to escort her out of Loch Muin while getting the details of a traitor in the Temerian ranks, one that led to the execution of the Blue Stripes. This turns into my absolute favorite form of quest, the coveted escort mission. Fortunately, Fuckface here can fight and defend herself a bit, so it doesn't take long to mow through the bandits who are after her before we get to a boat that she takes across the river. It's here that she fills you in on everything.
I don't know.
Great. No, but seriously, the woman pretended like she knew exactly what was going on here, but then instead used that to basically get a safe passage out of here. What she does know is that Boosie is probably dead, and that Anais was captured when a note from Baron Kimbolt arrived pressuring the carriage driver who was escorting the royal children to take a different path, which got them jumped by quote-unquote bandits. What Fuckface hypothesizes is that both Baron Kimbolt and Count Marivel have been plotting to take control of Temeria for a while now, which are two names that we heard an awful lot in Chapter 1. Both of these men are also at each other's throats, so they aren't colluding to her knowledge, but they're definitely both trying to seize Temeria in their own ways. So we're off to get some answers from each. We head to Kimbolt first, seeing as we have the letter from him. Kimbolt's a complete asshole that makes it immediately clear that he absolutely hates Geralt and any Witcher or Sword for Hire type for that matter, which makes it very easy to feel the need to cart the letter off to the constable and get his ass tied up in this. But Kimbolt does claim that the letter's a fake, and we can go alchemically test it to see if it is or not, which is fucking stupid. So basically the Baron tells you, hey, look, all of my official orders and correspondence is written on paper that's treated with an invisible ink. When you perform an alchemical test on the paper, it will turn blue. So go test that paper. See if it's real or fake. So you go test the paper by listening to a sleep-talking alchemist who's saying the order that you need to do things, whatever. You perform the correct steps on a test page, and it turns blue. Then you perform it on the supposed orders from Kimbolt, and it turns red, meaning that it hasn't been treated in Kimbolt's usual ink. So now this means that this is ironclad proof that the paper is a forgery. Except it doesn't mean that at all, because Kimbolt could have decided that if he wrote the orders on a plain piece of paper and it somehow got discovered, he could pull this card out of his ass and hope that his accuser is stupid enough to believe that there's no way for him to write on untreated paper.
You were right, Baron. The letter's forged.
The B-Team writers didn't stop there though, as this Kimbolt guy goes from, man, I fucking hate Witchers. Especially you. The only reason I'm even talking to you is because Foltest was cool and he liked you. To, well shit homie, you fell for my obvious lie. Here's some money, and also I think you're the perfect man for a job I have in mind.
Your kind doesn't understand this yet, but your life is about to change. Forever.
My kind.
Wanderers and scoundrels. People, and I use the term loosely, without loyalty or country. People for whom coin is the law and everything's for sale. You're a paid thug. Even if you refuse to acknowledge it. That murky set of principles, values call them. You cast them in the nearest corner when the price is right.
I'm not for sale.
Your payment, Witcher. I want you to look into another matter. Find out what Maravel's messenger is carrying. If treason is involved, you must alert John Natalis. You will be generously rewarded, I assure you.
So the long and short of this is that Kimboltz thinks that Maravel is doing something suspicious with Nilfgaard, and he wants Geralt to track down Maravel's mage to intercept any correspondence between the two. Meanwhile, Maravel tells you that Kimbolt's really the bad guy. Turns out that they both are, who would have thought? Yeah, apparently Kimbolt tried to have the kids killed, Maravel changed the course and tried to have them kidnapped instead, only for
Boosie
to accidentally die in the process. Constable John Fortnite Natalis throws his hands in the air and goes, "I may be the law around here, but I can't arrest both of them." So he strikes a deal with Kimbolt to back him up against Maravel because, hey, Kimbolt only planned to murder the children. He didn't actually do it. Ironically, if Maravel didn't interfere, the kids probably would have both died. But yeah, sure.
My words still mean something, unlike yours, you lying, rotting son of a whore.
And then they play a 5-second wordless scene of Maravel being led away, and that's the end of the quest. Wow, that was not a good quest. I mean, it wasn't awful, it was just kind of boring from the gameplay angle, and it had some shitty logic forced down the player's throat. I did like that these people who were all acting like they were torn up about Foltest dying are now showing their true colors when playing Pinata with his kids, but it was overall just an okay quest. So now we're back to the main stuff for the final time. The big decision this time around is choosing between going with Roach to save Anais, or going off to find and rescue Triss. This is another hard decision for me canonically, because I would think that Geralt would definitely go to save Triss. But that said, I did look up what the devs had the default world state look like in The Witcher 3, and surprisingly, or maybe unsurprisingly, everything that I've done so far has matched up with the way that the devs have the default world set up. With that in mind, going with Roach here is the decision that would continue to reflect that. That said, it doesn't really matter too much what you choose as far as the next game goes. Most of it instead is reflected immediately in The Witcher 2 itself, which is probably the better way to go if you're trying to plan things out. This game and series already has continuity issues when you play from every angle, the extent of which is probably better for someone more dedicated to the series to talk about. And I imagine that if every choice turned the setting of The Witcher 3 upside down, it probably would have been really hard to continue to make every single path shine as much as the developer intended path. But here's another angle, and it's going to be my deciding factor. I rescued Triss in my previous playthrough down Yorveth's path, and I want to see what the other side looks like, even if there's technically 3 angles here given that Yorveth is after an entirely different set of goals over Roach. So I take off and find Roach after we begin Army of Twoing our way to Deathmold, who apparently negotiated with someone for this entire area of Loch Muin. The lead up is about what you'd expect, though I do have to note 2 returning elements from the really annoying fight with Deathmold earlier. Any knight with a shield in this part of the game can just decide that he's gonna take a knee and listen to the coach instead of taking damage from you anymore, and it's an abysmal mechanic. I thought this was exclusive to Chris Pratt, but I learned soon after that other enemies can just do this too. Secondly, the Deathmold teleporting around and having a commercials break worth of iframes thing is just a mage thing too, apparently. I'd noticed it with other mages before this, but they weren't as annoying as Deathmold because they didn't eventually find themselves behind a wall of blue energy. So yeah, this whole walk up is just shielded soldiers and Deathmold's apprentice who's been studying his master's ways. After fighting our way through the battlefield with combat music that sounds like an Anthrax riff, we make it down to Deathmold in one of the most out of place scenes I think I've watched in a while. I mean, it's not like we walk in and Foltest is actually alive and just watching TV or anything like that. But, alright, let me try to describe this. So Deathmold is sitting here pruning himself and popping acne and generally maintaining his face, which is the first time that we've seen him do anything like that. Like the entire time in camp, he would gush over books, spells, knowledge, forbidden, powerful magic, and so on. It never popped into my head once, oh yeah, this dude is all about his own physical beauty. He's a very vain individual. But okay, sure, this is a big event, right? No problem, he's just making sure that he looks good in front of a bunch of higher-ups. Meanwhile, on his bed is a dude who's clearly ready for some action. No problem there, obviously. And then Roach and Geralt burst into the room. Roach breaks Deathmold's arm and then he cuts off his balls. Do you know the amount of people who have been rapists, who have done disgusting and vile things in this game that far outclass anything that Deathmold has done? If Vess had said, hey, make sure you cut off Laurito's balls for what he did to this elven woman, I would have understood that. If Roach had cut off Henselt's balls for what he did to Vess, I would have understood that. But we get a scene depicting Deathmold as being gay, which is fine, but a very superfluous detail. And Roach comes in and decides, I'm gonna cut this guy's balls off. It just seems like a really poor and distasteful writing choice. Either way, questionable writing aside, we now have Anais. Roach's plan is to hand her over to Radovid in the hopes that he will unite Redania and Temeria while preserving Temeria for at least a little bit longer. You can choose to convince him to instead hand her over to Natalis, so that Radovid doesn't decide to go back on his word, which is the option that I decide to go for. Well, the Order of the Flaming Rose isn't too happy about this decision, as Radovid has sent them to escort the child back to him. We take them out before finally getting to the big meeting here at the amphitheater of Loch Muin. Okay, strap in because this is going to be a lot to take in at once. So when the scene opens, we see Natalis basically stating that Temeria can't decide what to do because they have no heir. So their plan is to divide the land into provinces along the barony lines. Then we stroll in with Anais and he goes, oh, JK, we got a ruler now. So Radovid of all people goes, wait, she's a bastard child. That doesn't count. You know, Radovid, the person who literally negotiated a really high-end deal with Foltest so that he could marry his bastard child. And that's what doesn't make a lot of sense here with Radovid's new character format. For as cunning and wise as he is, why would he simply not insist that Ada is the rightful heir? She's as much Foltest's kid as Anais is, and it's the reason why he married her. The weak reason that the game gives from my limited knowledge is that 1, her mind is weak from being a Striga, and 2, people fear that she could turn again since the curse has been lifted twice by Geralt now. But what I don't get is, well, in the first game she was very much still mingling with the nobles, chatting them up, making deals, and giving orders in her father's absence. If the nobles have that big of an issue about her being in a position of power, wouldn't this have come up in the first game? Wouldn't Radovid, the king who cleverly positioned himself and paid attention to the state of Vizima, realize way sooner that the people of Temeria put no stock in Ada as a ruler? The reality is that the writers here decided that the way that things should go is that Ada should die in the first game, and then they never filled in the blanks for the second game when the player chooses to save her. So after Radovid weakly throws out that Anais is a bastard instead of insisting that she should be united with her half-sister in Redania or anything that would be a better excuse, Natalis has Anais escorted away. John Natalis will now be the substitute teacher of Temeria until Anais can make it through however many assassination attempts it takes to see her fully grown. The next big discussion on the docket here is to determine how to proceed with the Lodge of Sorceresses being fully integrated into the various kingdoms hierarchy. Basically, the sorceresses here are trying to insert themselves to have more power over the political realm so that there aren't random court mages in each country with their own agendas. If you rescued Triss, this does become a thing. But as things stand, Letho gets escorted in by the Nilfgaardians, who then confesses that he was put up to the task of killing kings by the Lodge of Sorceresses. Philippa Eilhart, Sheila de Tanserville, Triss Marigold, and a few other important names are all rattled off as co-conspirators. And the Order of the Flaming Rose comes filing in to arrest all mages present at the meeting. Here comes the dragon from the first part of the game to wreak havoc on the meeting, as it's made clear that it's working with Sheila and sweeps her away to safety. Alright, ready for round 2 of spotty writing? So this dragon is actually Saskia. If you've been playing the way that I have and never saw Yorveth's Path, you'd think, oh man, Sheila tamed a dragon. But if you've played Yorveth's Path, you'd know that Saskia is actually the dragon, and that she was put under a spell by Philippa Eilhart after Saskia was poisoned and put into a coma. The problem is that when you meet Saskia, she tells you, hey there, I'm in peak physical condition and haven't been poisoned recently. And you start to wonder when she was entranced by the sorceresses here to blindly follow them when she shows up at the meeting. It's even confirmed that Saskia was put under Philippa's spell by Sheila later on, but that she wasn't under that spell when she attacked the castle at the start of the game. It's a little messy when you have both sides of the picture, which is probably why I've avoided talking too much about it for this video. The whole alternative realities is something that I can kind of get behind even if it gets a little lazy. I mean, this game came from a fledgling developer with only so much budget to create completely unique big boss monsters for every outcome. But still, when the writers start mixing these realities willy-nilly to keep their big events as part of every branching storyline, it's a lot harder to accept the overlap without at least a little explanation. Either way, we're off to battle the dragon. This has us climbing up a tower while the dragon busts in at various places and breathes fire into it. If that at all sounds familiar to you, I'll have you know that I have confirmed that Todd Howard gave his blessing to this game and allowed CDPR to copy the intro to Skyrim. When you make it up to Sheila, she's like, "Haha, sucker, I've completed the teleport and I can leave at any time." I guess we're just gonna pretend that Geralt isn't a superhuman with reflexes that would be considered insanely fast, and instead just converse with the witch. She explains her side a bit, stating that she only hired Letho to take out Demoven because he was bad for Edirn, and that the Lodge determined that killing him was the lesser of two evils. From there, Letho started working with Nilfgaard to kill off Foltest and go after Henselt. This is a very key detail, because Letho was led into the amphitheater by Nilfgaardian soldiers. If you do play down Yorveth's path, it's revealed that a Nilfgaardian spy has ensnared Philippa Eilhart's heart and is using her to work for Nilfgaard's interest, which is a really fun plot twist that does make this game worth playing twice for all of its flaws. I also like how Geralt says, "Alright, where's Letho?" And Sheila's like, "I don't know, we've been tracking him down for a long time now," despite both of them seeing him in the amphitheater just now. But regardless, Sheila turns to leave only to discover that someone has replaced the diamond in her megascope. You have the option to save her here or to watch her be torn to shreds. I chose violence. To offset this choice and retain my Witcher neutrality, I spare the dragon. Oh yeah, there's a dragon fight, which is, not so good. I won't get too much into it, but you climb up and chop it down while casting Quen to keep its attacks at bay. Then you do some quick time events to mount it and make sure that you don't get shaken off. Small side note, the backdrop of this fight is fucking awesome looking, and reminds me heavily of Firelink Shrine and its surrounding area in Dark Souls 1. So yeah, we spare Saskia, and surprisingly, that's the end of Chapter 3. Like I said, it's an insanely short chapter compared to the second one, but I also think that its length helped it to not overstay its welcome. I would have liked to have been able to mingle a bit more with the various countries here, but I also know that the other paths between Yorveth and Triss really helped to make the second or third playthrough more rewarding. Speaking of, the epilogue begins with Geralt re-entering Loch Muin and meeting up with Roach, who states that the soldiers here went crazy after the dragon attack and began stringing up and hunting any mage who happened to be here. It's Radovid's wet dream, as that was one of the traits that followed him over from the first game.
No. Each sorceress believes she's to decide the fate of the world. Sometimes they do.
If you say so.
Don't disregard sorceresses. Beautiful, wise, helpful. At least so they present themselves. Someday, I'll put them in their place.
I do have to say that I find it off-putting that Geralt doesn't mention Triss here besides indirectly when he claims that not all sorceresses are bad people.
Triss.
Ah yeah, that's what I was forgetting. Yeah, Triss is alive and, well enough, as Letho saved her from Nilfgaard and protected her. Geralt sends Roach and Triss away before bearing down on the bulky Witcher for some answers and or combat for some reason. This is an, interesting conversation. There's so much to Letho that isn't revealed until the end of the game. And I really don't have a strong desire to fight him because I as a player really have no reason to beyond the game telling me to. I mean, let's look at what Letho has done. He saved Triss, he knew and traveled with Geralt, and he was the one who fucked with Sheila's diamond. Though the reason that he gives for that is that it was more of a mercy kill than anything malicious, as he hints that things were only going to get a lot worse for her from here on out. Hell of a mercy kill.
No!
But that's not all Letho has to tell you, as his explanation jostles the final memory gap that Geralt has. We're gonna have to go back a bit now because I've left this part out instead of explaining as things happened. There was a stage at the beginning of the game when Roach was talking to Geralt about Geralt's past, which he still didn't remember after all of this time. When he brings out a report from 5 years ago, Geralt has a flashback of his own death, in which there was a riot of sorts in Rivia. This riot occurred as the result of mounting tensions between non-humans and humans, and wound up with Geralt cutting down a load of humans before getting stabbed with a pitchfork by some dude named Rob. Geralt's true love Yennefer was there during that time, and she also died trying to patch Geralt up as he bled out. From this memory forward, Geralt will occasionally ask others around him about his and Yennefer's past. He goes through a couple more of these memory sequences throughout the game, including a couple of scenes showcasing him pursuing the Wild Hunt as it rampaged across the countryside before saving Letho from a monster and continuing his pursuit with him, Serret, and Ox by Geralt's side as his comrades. The full picture reveals that Yennefer was taken by the Wild Hunt when she and Geralt eluded death, which was Geralt's reason for pursuing the hunt so adamantly. They finally tracked down the hunt on a special night in which they weren't spectral in nature, and were instead flesh and blood human types. The four cut down as many as they could to get to Yen before they were overwhelmed. As a last bit of desperation, Geralt offered to exchange his life for Yennefer's, and the Wild Hunt agreed. So when Letho took Yennefer with him, she too suffered amnesia, since leaving the clutches of the hunt does that to people. They tried to help her get through it, but to no avail since she was erratic in her amnesiac state. Her behavior wound up attracting the eyes of the Emperor of Nilfgaard, and she was soon captured and never heard from by Letho again. The conversation goes on a bit to detail what exactly the hunt is, why Letho chose the path that he did, and so on. The Wild Hunt itself is a group of elves from another realm, one which has nothing to do with Geralt's realm. The group found its way to this realm for its own purposes which aren't spelled out in this game, and uses a form of projection to send the souls of its riders to this world. When they really want something, that's when they appear in their physical forms to take it, like what happened with Geralt and Yennefer. Letho, on the other hand, went down this route because the Emperor of Nilfgaard promised to rebuild the previously banned Witcher School of the Vipers in the south. He wants to re-establish the school so that him and his buddies have a place to call home, which is a good enough reason for me. The reason why the Emperor wanted Letho to do this was, well, to invade the north and take it over, obviously. To do this, he tasked Letho to assassinate as many kings as he could while also sowing seeds of doubt about the Lodge of Sorceresses, which he accomplished expertly when he got into the good graces of Sheila. Sheila had been used all this time, thinking that she was the one in charge. She even mentions that Letho may look like a big dumb idiot, but that he was actually as cunning as they came. Letho used her perception of him to get into her good graces, and pretended that he was her pawn. When he had thoroughly deceived her, she happened to ask him to assassinate Demavend, which was a stroke of luck that Letho hadn't foreseen, since he could now use that to breed suspicion of the Lodge of Sorceresses. Letho goes on to detail the exact specifications of the Foltest assassination and his time with Yorveth, all of which had just enough amount of luck to see him successful without becoming too unbelievable. When Sheila figured out that she had been double-crossed, she still believed that Letho was just a big toddler who happened to get manipulated by Yorveth, which is why she was in Flotsam to look for him. Though she doesn't state that to you at the time, instead going there under the ruse of trying to grab Kayrin bits to solve Henselt's infertility. But that's where the answers end, and you can choose whether or not to fight Letho one last time. Again, I have zero reason to fight him other than because I want to take another swing at the game's riveting combat. And so I do let him go, which is actually the only decision that I make that doesn't lead to the Witcher 3's default state. The thing is, this whole talk led me to realize something that I hadn't before. Letho could have altered Geralt's entire path in this game. But for some reason, despite having zero reason to do so, Letho decided to not tell Geralt, "Hey, we used to be friends and I looked after Yennefer while you were gone. I'm killing off kings because I want to re-establish the School of Vipers. Please don't interfere. I was not trying to set you up." Instead, he has Geralt chasing him to hell and back for no reason that I can think of beyond it creating a plot for this game to take place the way that it did. It's probably the biggest annoyance that I have with this game's writing. And the only thing that I could even remotely try to justify it with is the fact that he tried to restore Yen's memory repeatedly to no avail, and that he didn't even want to bother with it anymore after being captured and interrogated by Nilfgaard. But it was still stupid not to try. I think the only way that the devs could have told the exact same story the same way, and still have fighting Letho make sense, would have been to force Letho in some way to not tell Geralt anything. A sorceress cast a spell on him to keep him from saying anything specific about his work related to them. Or the Emperor of Nilfgaard wanted Letho to capture Geralt as part of their deal. I know that realistically it's like, why would Nilfgaard want one Witcher for any reason? But I mean, if you could make up a good enough excuse, maybe you could work that into Letho wanting to fight Geralt in order to bring him in. Maybe Yen told the Emperor something that piqued his curiosity about Geralt and he wanted to meet him, so he figured that Letho could hit two birds with one stone? You'd have to change a few story details, but I'm sure that it could be worked out. Admittedly, I'm certainly not versed in every detail of this series, having only ever played these two games and part of the third one, so maybe that hypothetical doesn't make sense, but I gotta believe that there was a way to make this final fight with Letho make complete sense, and then have it turn out that Letho's actually been a pretty good friend to Geralt this whole time, which is something that Geralt only finds out after a fatal blow to Letho. But either way, that's really it for this game. With no final battle, our last fight was against some Order members just before this, which is a really odd place for a video game to stop, and is probably the reason why you can fight Letho here at the end. I mean, again, it makes more sense to me for Geralt to let Letho go. So he does just that, and Geralt goes his own way with Roach and Triss. The game ends on Dandelion recapping every major decision that you've made and how it affected things briefly before the credits roll. And then the game tells you that you have to watch all the credits in order to see the end cutscene, and the credits are like 20 minutes long or something. I don't... Really? There's not even like a double speed? A lot of it's just other language stuff. I mean, I guess I understand the devs wanting to make sure that everybody sees the credits, but yeah, this is a little excessive. The final scene depicts a random Temerian dude going about his day before the Nilfgaardians roll through with their full crushing might, giving a brief glimpse of the war to come. It's not quite as intriguing per se as the first game's epilogue scene, but it's definitely more powerful and dramatic. It's a good note to end things on, and it sets up the political turmoil in the third game nicely. The Witcher 2 is a really interesting mix of very good and very bad. It has so many high points where I was just enraptured by what was going on screen. Moments of amazing storytelling, interesting characters, and really powerful choices. And then just like that, the game would snap me into the middle of a really terribly designed fight. A level where I would run back and forth repeatedly, and a confusing map to try to follow. But I'll try to start with the good stuff first. The first and foremost number one thing that I really appreciated above all else was the sheer amount of choices in this game. It feels like I could play through it 5, 6, or 7 times and still find new things to experience that I hadn't before. Realistically though, I would say that 2 playthroughs is almost mandatory and 3 is ideal, because there are so many little things that I didn't even convey throughout this video that happen with Yorvet's path. But more than that, a lot of the game's events make so much more sense now. And again, I tried to stray from that because I didn't really want to spend 2 months on The Witcher 2, but if I had played Roach's path without ever seeing Yorveth's, there would have been objectively wrong conclusions about things that I would have jumped to based off of the things that I saw on this path. And it's a really fascinating way to structure a game in my eyes, because it's not as if we jump between playing through the game as different characters. We're always playing as Geralt, but still experiencing what other characters in this universe are doing through Geralt's decisions. It's easily what makes this game worth playing. And I want to try to come up with some other positives that I really enjoyed to pad out the stuff that I liked about The Witcher 2, but I really can't. Which should actually go to show that the stuff that this game does do well is done really, really well. Now, the biggest issue with recommending that people play this game more than once to get the full experience is the fact that they have to play the game again. And I'm not being facetious, I mean that. This could have been no problem at all had there been a New Game Plus. Keep your skills, your gear, your level, and just plow through the game so that you can see what you missed. That would have been the way to make the idea of running through a lot of this stuff again much more tantalizing. But as things stand, this game has some of the worst combat that I've ever experienced in a more modern game. When I eventually did get bulked up, it didn't bother me as much, but the early game was rough going for much of it. I'm not going to work myself into a lather summarizing my thoughts on it again, but I will say that it's one of my least favorite things about this game, which is surprising to me because I thought for sure that it was going to take the crown for my least favorite part. But after thinking it over, I can't get over how much I had to run back and forth in Chapter 2. Yes, a lot of that chapter was intriguing, even more so when I compared it to my memories of Yorveth's path. But holy fucking shit. It dragged on and on and on and on with some of the most redundant backtracking that I've seen in a while. And then you get to an actual interesting location, a ruined elven city, and the chapter just ends in about a quarter of the time that Chapter 2 took. Honestly though, with the way that Loch Muin's roads and paths were planned out, I probably would have gone crazy if it took too much longer than it did. So there's definitely a trade-off there without some improvements. I think one of the oddest things about this game is the departure of how its questing is structured in general though. I did play about 20 hours of The Witcher 3, and I found myself playing side quest after side quest after side quest. And that was it. I was almost constantly bouncing around this open world and just doing things. When I think about what I did there compared to the other two games, I would say that The Witcher 2 was the most like the third game in this regard. A lot of the stuff that you can do in the first game is very akin to the third game on a smaller scale. Solve a problem here, do a quest there, dabble in some issues that the townsfolk of Vizima have, or stay out of it entirely. It didn't really feel too much like that in The Witcher 2, and instead I kept thinking of each setting as a level. I mean, yeah, there was dice and brawling and all that, but there really wasn't a lot that I felt like I could outright ignore. It was something that I initially complimented the game on. I believe I said something like, this game puts quality over quantity with its side quests. And I still stand by that, but it does make the game feel a lot different. There's nothing that feels like the swamp on the outskirts of Vizima. There's no gigantic rolling golden fields with noonwraiths dancing away, or village peasants on the outer walls of Vizima with their own issues. But there are those quests like the one with the former mental hospital, or the Wraith Sisters near the ocean, or the gargoyle extermination process. And these were highlights for me that kept me invested between the long walks. It's hard to say which method is better. Would I rather have a big open area with lots of little quests that range from half-baked mediocrity to ones with flashes of brilliance? Or would I rather have a smaller area with more focused side quests that are all generally good? And I think that for as much as I generally enjoyed most of The Witcher 2's side stuff, the series feels better when you're more of a traveling type that takes on problems for coin, rather than an unsung hero who gets caught up in messy politics consistently with almost no appreciation to show for it from the people that you've been helping. The Witcher 2 is worth playing, but you almost have to brace yourself for it. The world around Geralt being showcased more, the characters being fleshed out, the amnesiac hero slowly but surely coming to a conclusion about who he was, and ultimately understanding what exactly he wants. These are all very important for getting a better feeling for the third game. I know I never completed it, but I can tell that I wouldn't have cared as much about what was happening with certain factions or characters. I can tell that the deepest thing that I would have thought about the game without prior knowledge would have been, wow, this Geralt guy's cool, and that's about it. As tired of a concept that amnesia is to set up a character who technically has a prior history through another medium or set of games, it was never a cop-out to teach the player how the world works. CDPR did a great job taking that concept to its limits, and instead developed a character who has a personality, who has some knowledge, and who understands some of what he's supposed to be doing, but ultimately didn't understand who he was until the end of this game. But I don't think that I'll touch it again for a very long time. It has a lot going for it, and CDPR definitely put the best effort into the game that they could with the budget that they had. I'm really glad that the game did as well as it did, and that it set up the next game so well, even if all of the choices don't necessarily translate. When I do get around to The Witcher 3, I expect it'll take that 2 months that I didn't want to spend on this entry. But that's a problem for future me. Thanks for watching. This one actually turned out a lot longer than I thought it would, all things considered. It wasn't a horrendously long game, but with so many moving parts, I found myself taking the time to soak things in so as to not mess up too much of the game's intricate lore. I will eventually get to The Witcher 3, but for now I think I'm actually going to go for a shorter video. Actually, I have a more interesting direction for the next one coming up, but it should be out faster. Either way, until then, I've got shirts on my merch shop for those interested in customizing their wardrobe. Hell yeah, shirts. I've got a Twitch where I stream myself pressing buttons in the correct order sometimes, nearly every Monday, Tuesday, and Friday. I've got a Twitter where I pretend to know what a tweet looks like. I've got a Discord where people pretend to know how to talk to each other. And I've got a Patreon. And that's it. Have a good one.